Chris O'Connor here. Join our fabulous curmudgeonly community on Facebook at facebook.com/group/curmudgeonrock. Also look out for a Spotify playlist dedicated to this episode. Now, let's get started.
This is the Curmudgeon Rock Report, and this is your podcast made by rock geek iconoclastic outsiders for rock geek iconoclastic outsiders. For those of you who lament that rock music has gone the way of jazz and slipped into niche genre status, we are here to keep that flame alive by providing insight, analysis, recommendations, and honest takes, not hot takes. And hey, there's a good chance you'll learn some rock history you never knew before. As we continue our third golden age of rock series, the era when punk, post-punk, new wave, and synth pop emerged and forever changed the landscape of rock and pop music, we run into the halcyon year of 1977. In Rastafarianism and its weird take on numerology, the year was supposed to be an apocalyptic one, the year when the two sevens clashed. Well, for people living in New York City, it must have seemed apocalyptic with the high crime rate, the Son of Sam murders, and the infamous citywide blackout. Yet the city's music scene was bursting at the seams with creativity and innovation. While 1977 was the peak year for disco, with Studio 54 opening its doors, becoming the world's premier dance club, and the Saturday Night Fever soundtrack becoming one of the biggest selling albums ever, New York's rock music scene was slowly rising from the underground and drawing the attention of the music world to what was going on in and around that little club that could be CBGB's. Patti Smith may have led the way a couple of years earlier, but this year saw seminal albums by the Ramones, Television, Talking Heads, and Richard Hell and the Voidoids. Over in the UK, punk rock was exploding on an even grander scale and with an intensity not seen since Beatlemania. But only if Beatlemania was angry, nihilistic, dark, and occasionally violent. No band embodied this revolution like the Sex Pistols, and the only album they would ever release would send shockwaves, and those shockwaves are still being felt today. A slew of British punk and new wave bands followed in their wake, with debut albums and singles by the likes of The Clash, The Damned, Wire, and the Buzzcocks. Beyond punk, though, there are other hugely important musical developments. The German electronic group Kraftwerk released Trans-Europe Express, a seminal watershed moment in electronic pop music whose influence would echo throughout the ensuing decades. David Bowie tried to kick his cocaine habit by retreating to Berlin and found himself heavily influenced by the progressive rock and electronic music of the German bands of this time, resulting in his Berlin trilogy of records, some of the best and most enduring work of his legendary career. Fleetwood Mac navigated through the personal disarray and turmoil of their interband relations to put out Rumors, a landmark album of perfect pop rock and one of the greatest records ever made. And of course, Bob Marley capped off his stunning rise to prominence with the all-time classic and blockbuster success of Exodus. And in doing so, he not only became the biggest reggae star in the world, but almost single-handedly popularized the genre. The year 1977 truly is one of the greatest and most stacked years in the history of music. And we're going to celebrate it in this installment of our third Golden Age of Rock series. Welcome to the Curmudgeon Rock Report.
Well, Art, it's about that time. A special
what time is
really.
that?
It's time for us to tear into the space-time continuum and to enter the parallel universe. It's an interesting place here, the parallel universe. Blue is green, high is low, money grows on trees.
And good music gets millions of streams on Spotify.
Yes, it does. Yeah, good music is all over the place. Actually, there's no such thing as Spotify. This music is still a physical product in a parallel universe.
Damn
That's
right.
how,
We still have cassettes here.
yeah, cassettes and CDs and 8-track tapes, baby.
That's right.
And I'm telling you, we still revere music. We still revere rock and roll as a product. It's still all over the arenas. It's still all over the billboards. It's still on the cover of Rolling Stone. And rock and roll is predominant over here in
Right.
the parallel universe. That's a long, fancy way of saying that this is the segment of the show right here at the beginning where we cover new and newish music by artists that we think that you ought to dig, and that in a parallel universe would be big time, and the music that they do especially would be big time, even if the stuff that we cover isn't that great. Even if we're just doing 3 and 3 star albums, it's still stuff that'll be out there and important. So that's kind of the concept. So with that said, who are you giving love to here in the parallel universe on this episode, Arturo?
Yes. Hailing from the Netherlands, the indie rock band Personal Trainer released their second album, Still Willing, earlier this year. We reviewed their debut album, Big Love Blanket, in an episode 2 years ago. Ostensibly a vehicle for singer-songwriter Willem Smit, Personal Trainer has been dogged a bit by critics for just being Pavement ripoffs. Now, while the influence of that legendary 1990s band is certainly one of their core inspirations, the Pavement influence in Personal Trainer is greatly overstated. With their first album, you could hear distinct traces of Britpop era Blur and the indie dance rock of LCD Sound System. On their new album, Still Willing, the only song that sounds remotely Pavement-esque is in the title track's lo-fi, slightly noisy groove. If anything, it's solo Stephen Malkmus, Pavement's former frontman, that Smit aspires to, as evident in the wistful pop of I Can Be Your Personal Trainer. Round brings out more of the 1990s Britpop vibes by mirroring the jubilant pop rock of Super Furry Animals. And Intangible recalls the tight, sparse indie funk of Spoon. The only complaint I have of this album is that Smit and the band delve into the prog rock rabbit hole a little too much, with a few too many songs that are over fussy with multiple sections and changes that don't really jibe together. But overall, if you're delighted by a younger generation band that mines the best of 1990s and noughties indie slash alt rock, you can do a lot worse than Personal Trainer. I give the album about 3.5 stars. Chris?
Yeah, you could do a lot worse than them. Well, the one thing I'll say about them is at certain points on this album, they actually kind of remind me of the stuff that Wilco was doing on its first few records.
Huh. Okay.
Back when Jay Bennett was still there. It just has that kind of pop.
Yeah.
Not necessarily country, but that kind of pop vibe. I mean, especially the song "Personal Trainer."
Yeah.
On this record, especially, is very strong, and I they're pretty quirky. I will say this: you're right that like the album starts off not so great with the song "Upper Fern Tree Gully."
Yeah.
It's the 7.5 minute, almost 8 minute long song suite that changes like 7 times and is a
Yeah.
little too overly dramatic and makes you think that they're going the way of Black Country New Road or
Yeah.
some other like bad art rock band. But
And then
then
they remember, hey, melodies and hooks are a good thing. Let's do that
yeah,
instead.
and then they go back to melodies and hooks, and then they go back to that '90s rock palooza
Yeah.
again with Wilco and some Pavement and Super Furry Animals is actually a good call.
Yeah.
I like the song "Intangible." I think
Yeah.
that
Very
that
Spoon.
yeah,
Sounds like Spoon.
that's a very spoonish, danceable pop rock nugget. And so, yeah, they have their moments, and I think that they're a young band, and it's
Yeah.
only their
Really young.
second they're only their second album, and
Mhm.
they've put out a bunch of EPs and singles, and
Yeah.
so they actually have quite a bit of music out there for such a young band. But I think that they have a bright future if they can just tighten things up a little bit and get a little bit more consistent.
Right. I mean, more concise and focused. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, which is the same thing I can say for the band that I'm covering on this episode, the band English Teacher and their album This Could Be Texas. Now, English Teachers This Could Be Texas won this year's Mercury Prize in the UK, and I can see why. Yeah, the curse of the Mercury Prize raises its head, or rears its head. I can see why it won it, because it has the kind of sweeping ambition and experimentation that the critical intelligentsia in Britain seems to adore and prefer these days. In this case, however, that's actually not a bad thing. This young band from Leeds, England, has crafted what I'd say is a 3.5-star debut album full of artsy, restless tunes that sometimes veer towards British retro rock reverence, and sometimes veer into something far more symphonic and far weirder. English Teacher is ostensibly an art rock band, having formed while students at the Leeds Conservatory in the middle of the previous decade. They made their first impression on the UK public in 2021 with their modest hit R&B, an up-tempo rock thumper of a spoken word piece on which bandleader Lily Fontaine sings about the inherent tension of being a mixed-race person in a white-dominated rock scene. The song, which features on This Could Be Texas, as well, contains the clever lyric, "Despite appearances, I haven't got the voice for R&B, even though I've seen more colors shows than KEXPs," which, is kind of a neat little line. Now, with this debut LP, the band takes their sonic experiments all over the place to obviously uneven effect. At its best, English Teacher is a pretty innovative and quirky upbeat rock and roll band. Highlights on this album include the slowly building, oddly time-signatured rocker Broken Biscuits, which blows up into a dazzling layer of jazz horn noise by song's end, and also the bass and piano-driven melodic catchiness of the 4-minute banger Nearly Daffodils, and finally the turbocharged riff and noise rock of the world's biggest paving slab. The band at its worst, though, when it goes for is at its worst, really, when it goes for something moodier and darker. The title track, for instance, drones insufferably as Fontaine recites maudlin poetry. The song You Blister My Pain is a misguided attempt at a piano and strings ballad. At these intervals, the best one can say is, well, at least it's still better than Black Country New Road.
Yes, that's the one good thing I'll say about this album.
Here ultimately, though, is the fairest criticism of English Teacher I've seen at this point, which comes from Pitchfork's review of This Could Be Texas. Quote, "English Teacher can't leave a song alone. Not a track goes by without a twist or complication, whether a time signature change, an instrumental flourish, or a sudden wall of sound," end quote. Well, I definitely agree with that. And with time, maturity, and discipline, English Teacher could ultimately become one of the UK's best rock bands. But right now, it's at least an engaging and promising young act, one whose new Mercury Prize ultimately isn't entirely undeserved. Arturo, what say you about English Teacher?
I have a general rule of thumb. Whenever an album is described as a Mercury Prize winning album, avoid at all costs. If history has taught us anything, it's that Mercury winning albums usually suck, are quickly forgotten, and the quote unquote curse of the Mercury Prize is not a myth. Artists and bands that usually, and I mean the vast majority, that win this thing go on to have floundering careers afterward. And this English Teacher record is no exception. My God, is this band terrible, and is their album even worse? When it isn't being generic, cliche indie rock, formless, shapeless, indistinct, and derivative of naughties like early 2000s indie rock, and when it's not being that, it's being lightweight, middle-of-the-road piano pop with the most obnoxious, pretentious, spoken word gibberish lyrics imaginable. Now, spoken word vocals are becoming a hip thing now in
they are.
alternative rock circles, especially in the UK. And I think I know why. It's to cover up the fact that so many of these new lead singers, quote unquote,
can't
either
sing.
have extremely limited vocal range or they can't sing at all. No exception at all with Lily Fontaine in this band. The only halfway decent track on the album is one of the ones you mentioned, Chris, R&B. The only song that has any kind of true indie rock urgency and edge that this inept band aspires to. Again, Mercury Prize winner, avoid at all costs. They'll be forgotten soon enough. If you want to hear a good band from Leeds, England, check out Yard Act.
Chris here again. Arturo and I have differing feelings about the subscription streaming service Spotify. While he likes to rail against the algorithmic component, I like the ability to find and then manage a personal catalog of music. The program is especially great for assembling playlists. Well, guess what? We've assembled a playlist to accompany this episode. The playlist features a healthy mix of all the music we describe and analyze during the episode. Think of it as a soundtrack to your curmudgeonly life. Find the link in this episode's description. And also become a member of our curmudgeonly community on Facebook if you haven't done so already. Let's now return to our regularly scheduled programming.
So, 1977, in my opinion, one of the single greatest years in the history of music. A stacked year throughout multiple genres of music. I love listening to the music of this year, and the story of this year has to start with the Sex Pistols. Chris, in the previous episode, 1976, you talked about the Sex Pistols' beginnings. Now we're going to talk about the album itself. Never Mind the Bollocks. Here's the Sex Pistols. Tell us, Chris.
Yeah, absolutely. So we did establish in that previous episode of this third golden age of rock series that the Sex Pistols had birthed an unquestionably influential movement within the UK during 1976. The band, as we said, was the creation of a risque leather and lingerie shop owner in London named Malcolm McLaren. And during that year, the band's profile as a killer live band and an undeniable rabble-rouser grew organically to the point where its first single, Anarchy in the UK, placed in the top 40 in the British pop charts. That all set up the explosion that occurred in 1977 for not only the Sex Pistols, but also for punk rock as a whole. The music was the movement, was the zeitgeist, and all across the UK, spiky hair, leather, denim, and chains became normative for a generation of disaffected young people. And Never Mind the Bollocks, Here's the Sex Pistols was the scorching, ass-kicking soundtrack for it all. The album is one of the angriest and angstiest ever made, an unnerving expression of disillusionment and violent inner and occasionally outer psychic warfare. The album blasts through 39 relentless, furious minutes of nihilistic rock and roll. It might as well be one long balls-out song. Yet for as angry and as jaded as it all is, the album is also undyingly tuneful, standing as one of the tightest and most riff-tastic hard rock albums imaginable. Johnny Rotten and Steve Jones and company may have looked the part, but they could perform and play this music really, really competently and really, really terrifically. So, let's take a song-by-song run through Never Mind the Bollocks, which is probably the best way to express the majesty and swaggering nastiness of this record.
Yeah.
We'll focus especially on the lyrics. So first you have Holidays in the Sun, where you starts off with the sound of a literal marching on the beat and follows up with a killer dive bomb guitar riff. And the song is essentially all about the fantasy of crashing the Berlin Wall. And, you've got the lyric that says, I dared to ask for sunshine and I got World War III. And just talks about how he's going to go over the Berlin Wall and he's going to crash it. And just basically, very, very, very direct. It's probably the most political song on the album. The rest of it is well, I guess you could say that it's a fairly political record, but this one, like I said, puts focus on the Berlin Wall and puts focus on communism and puts focus on how to, get involved in that and to really just kind of put the foot down and, to sort of take back the streets. Next, you have Bodies, which is got another dive bomb riff and is faster and angrier than the preceding song. However, it's also got the most disgusting and disturbing imagery on the record. It basically, basically talking about a discarded fetus that it's not an animal, it's an abortion, and talking about basically comparing themselves to a discarded fetus. And so it's just, really disgusting, but at the same time funny in the sense that they actually had the nerve to go there.
Yeah,
And
I know.
and the nerve to actually compare themselves to an abortion, and say, hey, we're so loathsome, we're like an abortion. Yeesh. And then from there, you get the song No Feelings, which is a bash out anthem of disaffection. and a statement of cultural psychopathy. And quote there says, "You come up and see me, and I'll beat you black and blue. Okay, I'll send you away." And also just has the the line of, it has, "I have no feeling for anybody else except for myself." And so
Jeez.
basically it's a big huge fuck off,
Yeah.
but it bashes out, and it gets even more anarchic than the preceding songs. Then you have Liar, where hey, it has an actual lead line in the intro and an
Mm.
actual little solo from Steve Jones. Beforehand, it's been all riff, it's been all
Right.
riff and all bash out, but here you actually get some nuance. But you do not get any sort of relenting in the attitude, where it
Mm.
says you're in suspension, you're a liar, and just sort of just talking to, just basically uh, talking back to power and saying that we can't believe a thing you say and that you're all full of shit. Then comes the song Problems, which is one of the better songs on the record, which is just a bashed out
I thought
bopper.
God Save the Queen came before Problems.
Nope, God can't, God Save the Queen comes after Problems.
Oh, really? Okay. All right. Never mind.
Yep, comes right after Problems. You got that mixed up.
Yeah.
So you have Problems, which again is a bashed out bopper with a strangely profound lyric. And I'll quote some the lyrics kind of at length here. At one point he says, "Eat your heart out on a plastic tray," and so the imagery is pretty pronounced. And then it says, "You won't find me working a 9 to 5. It's too much fun being alive. The problem is you. What you gonna do?" And then further it goes, it says, "I ain't equipment, I ain't automatic. You won't find me just staying static. Don't give me any order. For people like me, there is no order. Bet you thought you had it all worked out. Bet you thought you knew what I was about. Bet you thought you'd solve all your problems, but you are the problem." And so just really direct
This guy really hates society.
yeah, yeah, he really does. And it actually ends with what I think is Rotten's finest moment on this album, where he just has this droning vocal intonation over and over again, problem,
Yeah.
problem, problem,
Yeah.
problem,
And then he
over
ends it like
over
that. Yeah.
yeah, over and over again, and just sort of, just make, just a really just biting cultural criticism of just, people that are just doing the conventional thing and just sort of going through life not giving, not feeling alive or not giving themselves any kind of credit. You are the problem because you're the sheep,
Yeah.
is what he's
Right.
saying. And then next comes God Save the Queen, which I think is the best song on the album. And a lot of
Wow.
people think it's the best song on the album. It's just great riff and just, absolutely evocative and provocative lyrics.
Mm.
God Save the Queen, a fascist regime, and then more sort of, this idea that, here we are, disaffected youth, God save the Queen, but the rest of us are fucked, is basically what he's saying, with the lyric, "Oh, when there's no future, how can there be sin? We're the flowers in the dustbin, we're the poison in your human machine. We're the future, your future." And then it has like probably the most desperate outro imaginable too. One of the great desperate outros of all time. No future, no future, no future for you.
Nihilism done as anthemic arena rock.
Yep. And Rotten yelps it out like he means it. I mean, the pathos really resonates. It's an oddly moving song.
Yeah.
The idea that he's really so disaffected and so disillusioned that he actually is sincerely talking about how him and the rest of his generation literally has no future.
Yeah.
It's pretty rough. Next comes the song 17, which is probably the most nihilistic song on the album because it doesn't even form a real melody, and it just has
Yeah.
this sort of just real crunchiness, and it's just an onslaught of non-apologia where he says, "I don't work, I just speed. That's all I need. I'm a lazy sod." Yeah, and over again, just pointing out how lazy he is and how you can all fuck off. And then comes Anarchy in the UK, which, we had, as we said in the last album, had become a top 40 hit, or the last episode had become a top 40 hit, and has one of the great all-time opening lyrics. You want to sing it, Art?
What, Anarchy in the UK? Oh my
Yeah.
God. I am the Antichrist. I am an anarchist. When that came out in 76, that was so controversial.
Yep.
Antichrist and anarchist.
Yep. Yeah. The fact that
Great,
he,
one of the best opening lines for any
yeah,
lyric in rock history.
but also the recitation of it to the I am an antichrista. I
Yeah,
am an
yeah,
anarchista.
yeah, yeah,
Just great. So it's got the poppiest riff and solo on the record. They clearly were gunning for a radio takeover with the song, and they basically got it.
yeah.
And and again, just really bleak lyrics. How many ways to get what you want? I use the best, I use the rest. And then the last line is great. I get pissed, destroy.
That's like a Muppet Show lyric by Animal, the drummer.
Yeah, yeah, seriously. Yeah. And so next comes Submission, which is the weirdest song on the record
It's
because
about
it's
S&M. It's about sadomasochistic sex.
yeah, and it's basically it slows things down, and it's all about basically going down, and it's like he has a mystery crush on a woman, and he has a fantasia about an underwater adventure brought on by a woman or something like that. And I guess I was taking it literally because he's talking about Octopus Rock, and he's
Mm,
talking about like he's on a submission in a submarine, and
yeah.
so as far as best I can figure, if it's S&M, that he's really focused on eating pussy. Yeah, that's the only thing I can figure. But it's a weird song because again, it's slower
Yeah.
probably than anything else on the record. And then it has that where again, I guess I didn't pick up on and I never have picked up on the fact that it's about S&M. I don't know how you picked up on that, but
Read the lyrics.
okay. Well, I did read the lyrics, and they come across as a subversive or a not subversive. What am I trying to say? Like almost like a surrealist thing about finding yourself underwater through the love of a woman, or you're lusting after a woman and finding yourself in the ocean as a result of it. Just very, very, very strange.
Yeah. Well,
Very,
she's dominating him.
okay. Well, I guess that makes sense. In that sense, he's being so dominated, he's been poured into the ocean.
Yeah.
Jeez. Yeah, I want to meet her. Let me get her number. And then comes another one of the highlights of the record, Pretty Vacant,
Yeah.
which, basically a really funny lyric about being nuts and a little off in life.
Yeah.
Don't ask us to attend because we're not all there. Oh, don't pretend because I don't care. I don't believe illusions because too much is real. So stop your cheap comment because we know what you feel.
Mm,
You'll always find me out to lunch. And he says that line twice. And so,
yeah.
everything is oh so pretty, pretty vacant.
Yeah.
So, yeah, so you're talking about another about a psychopathy there.
Mm,
And then comes the song New York, which is just purely obnoxious energy. It's a song that actually has nothing to do with New York. There's a reason we excluded this song from our list of the greatest songs about or held in New York City for that one episode we did,
it's
because
not about New York at all.
yeah, because past the opening lines, descriptor of its antagonist being uh, a guy from New York, the song has nothing to do with the city. It actually mentions Japan a lot more than New York, and it has like one of the like crudest and rudest lyrics on the entire album on it, where he says, "You're 4 years on, you still look the same. I think about time, you changed your brain. You're just a pile of shit. You're coming to this, you poor little faggot. You sealed with a kiss. Kiss me."
Yeah.
And it's like, yeah,
Yeah.
and then ends with the lyrics. It's a kiss, a kiss. You're sealed with a kiss. Looking for a kiss. It's coming to this. I want to kiss anything. Oh, kiss this, gay boy. Jeez.
A little homophobia by John Lydon there.
Yeah, you don't say.
Yeah.
Johnny Rotten gets a little homophobic. He's talking shit and he's going into unfortunate old places. And then
Yeah.
he ends the album, or the Sex Pistols end the album, with a paean to their former label. The name of the song is EMI. EMI famously, at the end of 1976, they went on a national talk show and made a profane mess of themselves. That they swore like crazy, and one of the members to like literally hit on Susie Sue the entire time.
Yeah, Bill
It's
Grundy was the host of the show, and he was kind of drunk himself, and he was just like being really condescending and being a snide dickhead. And he basically made a pass at a very young Susie Sue. She was like 20 years old at the time because she was part of the Sex Pistols entourage before she went on to do Susie and the Banshees. And
yeah.
it got national headlines in the UK, and yeah, they got kicked out of their label for it.
Yep, and EMI dropped them and figured that they were a bunch of cretins, and so this is their revenge on EMI. And the lyric here is ever, 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 and you thought we were faking it, that we were all just money making. You do not believe we're for real, or would you lose your cheap appeal? Uh, Song, and therefore the album ends with what sounds like a little mouth fart, which is a perfect way to end the most searingly annoyed and pissed off albums ever made. One of them,
Yeah.
just searingly annoyed and searingly pissed off. So, folks, that's Never Mind the Bollocks. Here's the Sex Pistol, the gold standard of British punk rock. No
Yeah.
one did it gnarlier, and no one did it with more piss and vinegar ever. A band this impossibly pissed off and chaotic perhaps never could have lasted. And indeed, the Sex Pistols imploded on stage the next year, early in 1978, and broke up for good. But for one shining monumental year, the Sex Pistols lived as one of the greatest bands of all time. And this album is the immortal testament to that. Amen, brother. Right,
Right.
Arturo?
Yeah. First thing about the track listing about like God Save the Queen and Problems. In the US edition, Problems comes before God Save the Queen, but in the original UK edition, which is the one I have, it's God Save the Queen track 5, Problems track
Ah,
6. Ah.
that
So there you
explains
go.
that one.
Yeah. And well, you pretty much covered everything. But what I'm going to say is that for an album that's and a band that's supposed to be this radical and revolutionary and just so out there, it's amazing how orthodox the man how orthodox rock and roll the music on this album is.
Yeah,
It's
it's
not
true.
hardcore punk. It's not as fast as the Ramones. It's Thurston Moore in an interview when he did for another documentary about the New York no wave scene. This documentary came out back in 2005, but he mentions the Sex Pistols, Never Mind the Bollocks album, and basically he says, yeah, I love it. It's a great record. But there's nothing really radical or revolutionary about it. It's just really revved up Chuck Berry riffs. And it's
Yeah.
true. They're just a lot. I mean, what's his name? Jones, Mick Jones, not Mick Jones. What am I talking about? Steve
Steve
Jones. Mick
Jones.
Jones is the Clash. Steve Jones does a really good job. I mean, he plays his ass off on this record. And he does some good soloing and some great riffs. But it's pretty orthodox. It's not the lyric. Johnny Rotten himself and his lyrics are revolutionary, much more so than the music is. You know
Yeah,
what I
that's
mean?
true.
Yeah.
That's true.
So
That's what I'm
yeah,
saying. And the thing about this, like I said, it's basically one long song that
yeah.
it's a collection of riffs. It's not like there's ballads and there's not like there's things that are mixed up. It's just like one bash out after another.
Right. Right.
You
Sure.
know.
All right. So now let's go beyond the Sex Pistols. For as seminal as the Sex Pistols were in this era, they ushered in an era of UK punk with bands that were every bit as good, if not better and longer lasting than the Pistols were. In particular, this one band I'm going to talk about soon. And here are some other classic British punk albums of the year 77 that deserve discussion and a light shined on them. And you have to start with The Clash and their self-titled debut album. This is the original UK version of their debut album, not to be confused with the bullshit US version that came out 2 years later with a different running order and including songs that were recorded after 1977 with a completely different sound quality to the rough, tough, tight, compressed sound that characterized the true UK debut album. While The Clash formed very shortly after co-frontmen Joe Strummer and Mick Jones saw the Sex Pistols live the previous year, they would go on to be every bit as musically and culturally important and arguably more
More
influential.
so.
And when the argument as to who the greatest punk rock band of all time gets going, it always comes down to the Sex Pistols, the Ramones, and the Clash, with the answer arguably being the Clash, especially when you consider the staggering versatility and eclecticism of their discography and how multiple generations of punk bands and bands all across the rock spectrum throughout multiple generations owe a debt to the Clash's, musical influence and political activism. While the notion that the Sex Pistols couldn't play their instruments is, quite frankly, a stupid myth, the fact remains that as musicians, the Clash blew them out of the water.
Yeah.
Mick Jones was truly a fantastic lead guitar player and prodigious songwriter, while Topper Headon, who joined them shortly after the recording of the original debut album, was a drummer who had a background in jazz and progressive rock bands. With Joe Strummer, they had a lead singer who was a surprisingly versatile musician, but more importantly, someone who possessed one of the most distinctive and powerful voices in rock history, as well as an almost shamanistic stage presence. As a lyricist, while he shared Johnny Rotten's nihilism early on, he would develop into a wonderful storyteller with a rebellious vision of hope and an astute socio-political poignancy in his words that made Bob Dylan a fan. And as Paul Simonon, who admittedly couldn't play bass when he first joined, they had a bassist who, by the end of the Clash's run, had become one of, if not the steadiest bass player in all of rock. But let's focus on this startling debut album. The biggest hit was the rampaging White Riot, where Strummer shows solidarity with the oppressed black community of England at the time, supporting their street protests while pulling off the balancing act of saying that working class white people should rebel against the same oppressors. The all-encompassing musical diversity that would define the Clash later on is in full effect with White Man and Hammersmith Palais, which rides a downbeat ska groove. Only Joe Strummer can begin a song that laments the shallow commerciality of pop reggae and somehow transitions to a rumination on nonviolence, the lack of wealth distribution in the world, and the need for white and black youth to unite. The anthemic "I'm So Bored with the USA" sees the band raging against America's seeming monopoly on music and movie entertainment and pop culture. Career Opportunities is a scathing indictment of income inequality. The chugging London's Burning addresses the despair at the monotonous city life in a post-industrial world. And Police and Thieves is a genuinely moving cover of Junior Murvin and Lee Scratch Perry's reggae classic. One of the greatest debut albums of all time, The Clash, the self-titled album, is a soaring firecracker of an album that launched the career of arguably punk rock's greatest band. Chris?
Yeah, it really is a great album, and it's amazing to me how much better this band got.
Yeah.
Even from that, because like I said, this is a searing, rocking, like really punked out affair. But then nothing at it like hinted at the sophistication of like they would do on like London Calling or Sandinista.
Yeah.
With like you said, Simonon really developed as a bassist. Mick Jones got poppier in his songwriting. And even Joe Strummer, like embracing reggae to a more pronounced degree. So the fact that they got it even better from this, if they had just released this record, they would be a notable band. But the totality of their catalog made them one of the greatest bands of all time, and probably the most important of these bands. In the grand scheme of things.
They made an album that is in the running for greatest album of all time. We're going to talk about that in the 1979 episode, folks.
Yep.
Okay. The next band that put out their debut album in 77 from the UK, The Damned, with Damned, Damned, Damned. Then, now and forever, the axis of British punk rock hinges on the duality of the Sex Pistols and the Clash. However, The Damned, or at the very least the original version of The Damned, where original guitarist Brian James wrote all the songs, are deserving of their plaudits as well. They released their first single, New Rose, in 1976, several months before the Pistols released their first single. And of course, they released their debut album, Damned, 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 several months before the Pistols released Never Mind the Bollocks. The Damned were yet another punk band that bucked the stereotype that punks couldn't play their instruments. Brian James wasn't just the band's main songwriter, and a fine good one at that, as he provided the Damned some of the greatest songs of the early punk era. But he was a fantastic guitar player whose solos were just as blistering as his riffs. Drummer Rat Scabies had a punishing, intense, maniacal style that was deeply indebted to The Who's Keith Moon. Bassist Captain Sensible was underrated in his versatility in that his pulsating bass lines powered the Damned's early songs before he took over guitar duties after James left the band. And in singer Dave Vanian, with vampire makeup and his Victorian punk weirdo sense of dress, they had a proto-goth frontman. Their songs weren't as politically charged as The Clash, nor did they have the Sex Pistols' nihilistic sense of socio-cultural dread, but they made up for it with an irreverent, charming sense of insouciant humor and the simply high-octane, hurtling off the cliff energy of their songs. We talked about the single New Rose in the 1976 episode of this third Golden Age of Rock series, and that song appears again on Damn Damn Damned, which kicks off with Neat Neat Neat, a track that matches the intensity of New Rose, as well as possessing that song's feeling of getting faster and harder as the song moves on. Songs like I Fall, Born to Kill, Stab Your Back, Fish, and See Her Tonight rock with amphetamine-fueled abandon. Even their cover of the Stooges' Feel All Right makes the Iggy Pop original seem like a mid-tempo slog by comparison. Brian James would do one more album with the band before he left, and while the Damned would go on to make many more records and have an enduring career, they never came close to matching the full-throttle sonic attack of their first album. Chris?
Yeah, it's worth mentioning that the song Neat 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 has 35 million plus plays on Spotify.
Jesus.
By far the most popular song on the record, but that's actually really good for any band. And
Yeah.
so Neat 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 is kind of an anthem for folks that are exploring pop or exploring
Yeah.
punk
Yeah.
for the first
Should
time.
be.
And it should be
Yeah.
because it's a kick-ass song. And that's what I like about this band. They're a surprisingly musical band because the music is
Yeah.
as sensual as it is swaggering. It's
Yeah.
not just three chords and a dream. It's actually got some sophistication to it, especially, like I said, in the guitar playing and the drumming. And you mentioned that. And so, really, they're a band worth celebrating. Even if they only have like the one or two great albums,
Yeah.
they still have their place in, as really like ground floor punk
Yeah.
and just really, really strong stuff.
Yeah. The next band, another British band with their debut album in 77, Wire with Pink Flag. Many years ago, Chris, when we were roommates in New York, I played you this album, and your reaction was basically to call them the British Ramones. And with this album specifically, it isn't wrong. If the Ramones went to our art school and had more obtuse or abstract lyrics. Nevertheless, the members of Wire, at least on this debut album, shared the Ramones' concept of rock and roll as stripped down as possible, taking away all guitar solos and even the bridges to songs. But when the rhythms are this tight, the riffs are this catchy, and the songs are this brutally energetic, who cares? The riff for the mid-tempo three-girl rumba has an earworm riff that was stolen by Elastica for their 1995 song Connection. Ex-Lion Tamer and Mannequin soar with a propulsion that borders on arena rock. Strange is, well, one of the strangest songs on the album in that it lurches along in a sludgy mid-tempo groove that climaxes with noise and feedback. REM would do a cover that revs up the tempo on their classic 1987 album Document. By the time the record ends with a rip-roaring 12 times you have the sense of having just heard one of the most exhilarating 35 minutes and 22 seconds of primo punk rock you've ever heard. Wire would go on to have a very long, musically eclectic, and adventurous career spotted by moments of hiatus. And it's the album they would put out the following year that I deem to be their masterpiece and a landmark of post-punk. But that's a discussion for the next episode in this series. Chris?
There you go. Well, it's not only 35 minutes and 22 seconds long, it's 21 songs and 35 minutes. So there's a lot of good short boppers on
Yeah.
this record, and that's what kind of lends. That's probably where my comment about them being the British Ramones came from. It's these short, energetic, crunchy, loud,
Yeah.
but poppy songs.
Yeah.
You know that they really were really great songwriters,
Yeah.
and obviously Strange being covered by REM kind of proves that they had a legacy
Right.
that was worth celebrating. I mean, the REM cover is fucking great.
It's better.
Uh,
It's better than the Wire
yeah,
original.
it's way better. And Mannequin actually we should talk about that song because that's really kind of like proto new wave, isn't it?
Yeah,
That's
it really
that's
is.
that's like an early new wave song. It's like it's just a really tight, really great little rocker, but also has a swing to it that was really akin to new wave. So really great stuff. And that song's got 19 million plays on Spotify.
Wow.
So that's their top song. So really good stuff. Again, my kind of album these days, 21 songs, 35 minutes. You can't beat that.
All right. And next, and the final of these British punk debut albums of 77, Elvis Costello, My Aim Is True. I'll admit that it's a bit of a stretch to lump Elvis Costello in with punk rock, but when he emerged in 1977, such was the spikiness in his sharp songs and the almost vitriolic anger in his lyrics that he stood alongside the punks on pure energy alone. Yet another one of the greatest debut albums of all time, it contains some of the man's most famous songs that endure to this day. There are more perfectly crafted all-time great songs on this one album than most bands manage to achieve in an entire career. That's how fully formed Costello's songwriting and performing craft already were at the tender age of 23. Of course, the ballad Allison is the song that most people remember, and rightfully so. Rarely do love songs convey such emotional complexity that haunts all romantic relationships, much less songs about unrequited love. To this day, I've never quite figured out what the Angels Want to Wear My Red Shoes is about. But man, is it an immaculately crafted and subtly complex construction of a pop song that never fails to be incessantly catchy. Less Than Zero is the quintessential new wave pop song and has one of Costello's most disturbing lyrical narratives. Just listen to the lyrics, folks. You trust me. And of course, Watching the Detectives proves that the Clash weren't the only white British artists at the time enamored with reggae. During this early period of Costello's career, it was a platform for a lengthy jam that he would do on stage. Track after track of pop rock splendor and witty to intellectual lyrics. It's a perfect record, one of Costello's three very best albums that still cast a long shadow over his discography to this day. But Chris, I know you're not big on this album.
Yeah, my take on this album has always been meh. Allison is a great song. Obviously, that's a perfect pop song, and Watching the Detectives is great. But the rest of it just leaves a lot to be desired. I mean, I think that this year's model was definitely a vast improvement the next
Well,
year.
it's definitely a better band. The Attractions are on that album.
Yeah, it's a better band and better songs and better energy. But this album is just kind of it is what it is for me. Again, a couple of great songs. Costello had a thing, he had the kind of the angry, bratty, smarter than thou young man act down to a
Yeah.
T. So
Yeah.
that's really kind of how he fits. He fits the punk rock aesthetic without actually being like true punk rock.
Yeah.
And so I think that's why I think you were smart to include him on this list, especially given that it was his debut record.
Yeah.
So smart inclusion, but I'm just not a huge fan of it.
All
Just
right.
not my thing.
All right. So now we cross the Atlantic Ocean to the east coast of the US and particularly New York. Yes, the New York punk scene had a lot of debut albums in 1977. And there are four in particular we're going to talk about. Chris, got to start with the Ramones.
Yeah, and got to start with a few
Not,
words.
not a debut album, their second album. Sorry, their second
Yeah,
album.
yeah, and you really got to start. Let's talk a little bit about CBGB as a venue.
Yeah.
which is where a lot of these bands, cut their teeth and was kind of their home base. By 1977, CBGB was officially a thing in New York City. Hilly Crystal's Billy or Bowery-based club on the Lower East Side of Manhattan had been home to an exciting mix of band for several years. But with the breakout of first the Patti Smith Group in 1975 and then the Ramones in 1976, the home base for those artists gained a broader following for its artsy brand of punk rock, and the shows that emanated from that small and, let's face it, kind of shitty club became the stuff of legends. I guess I can kind of call it kind of shitty because Arturo and I had the privilege of seeing Yoko Ono and Chiba Mato there on New
Well,
Year's
Yoko
Eve.
Ono didn't play. It was Sean Lennon playing with Chibo Mato. I just bumped into Yoko Ono at the bar.
No, no, Yoko Ono got on stage and performed
She
a
did?
couple of songs.
Oh, really? Okay. All right.
Yeah,
I don't
no,
remember.
she did.
I must have been
And
really drunk.
yeah, she performed a couple of songs, and so it was kind of an experience seeing that. But yeah, it was kind of a shithole venue,
It was
and it
very
was
small.
very, very small. It was surprisingly small. It's
Yeah.
like there was probably only enough room for the musicians to get their stuff in and out of the back, and that was like it. And but could you imagine seeing the Ramones in a club that small,
Yeah, I
or
know.
Talking Heads in a club that small? They must have just blown the fucking roof off the place.
Yeah,
So,
no shit.
but anyway, CBGB's status as the first American venue to host a British punk band, uh, as it did for the Damned in 1977, confirmed how much the club meant to the local and larger musical punk community. It's kind of funny in retrospect that CBGB stood for Country Blues, Bluegrass, and Blues. Crystal's original mission was to turn his purchase into a home base for those musical styles. Hey, it's a forgivable miss, but let's give it up now for the actual full name of the club, which was CBGB and OMFUG, which stands for Country, Bluegrass, Blues, and Other Music for Uplifting Gormandizers. Certainly
Okay.
they certainly got that musical Gormandizer part right. Yum. I
Yeah.
mean, for instance, here's a roll call of the bands that cut their teeth in the club, and which is just an amazing read. You have the Talking Heads, Blondie, Suicide, Television, Richard Hell and the Voivods, the Misfits,
Voidoids. Voidoids.
the Voivoids,
The Voidoids.
the Voidoids.
There you go.
Okay, Richard Hell and the Voidoids, the Misfits, the Dead Boys, the Fleshtones, the Cramps, Joan Jett and the Blackhearts, Bad Brains, the Beastie Boys in its original point form, and Agnostic Front.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
CBGB remained a primary showcase venue for punk rock and art rock of all varieties until its closing in 2006. 1977, as it turned out, was something of a watershed year for CBGB artists in terms of their recorded output, and several of the best bands from the scene released notable, exciting, and in a couple of instances, all-time great albums that year. Here now is a roll call. So you kind of mentioned where we're going here. We're going to start off with the Ramones and their album Leave Home, which is a follow-up to their absolutely perfect self-titled debut from the year before. Now, Ramones, that album released in '76, was the sound of four weirdos from Forest Hills, Queens, showing their affection for Phil Spector and Surf Rack in an idiosyncratic, amped up guitar driven formula. It was unusual and unusually exciting. It mixed cartoon, goofy violence on songs like Beat on the Brat with the real kind of violence, as on the harrowing tale of turning tricks for drugs on 53rd and 3rd.
Hmm.
Nobody had ever seen or heard anything like it, and the only time anyone ever saw anything like it again was, well, in 1977, when the Ramones blasted back out of the gate with this reverent follow-up album called Leave Home. So, Leave Home is 14 songs covering 31 relentless minutes of girl group inspired, clap happy punk rock fire. I Remember You, California Sun, and You're Gonna Kill That Girl kick up the 50s bop rock vibe several notches. This stuff is damn near ironically sunny. The acerbic gallows humor on full display in the debut carries over here to album opener Glad to See You Go, which includes this hilarious lyric: Going to take a chance on her, one bullet in the cylinder, and in a moment of passion, get the glory like Charles Manson. Gonna smile, I'm gonna laugh. You're gonna get to the bloodbath. In a moment of passion, get the glory like Charles Manson. Yeesh.
Yeesh.
Yeah. And then there's also Susie as a headbanger, which, yes, is a simple cranked out ode to a girl banging her head. They love her, yet somehow they think her mother is a geek. Random line for a random for a somewhat random song. But then the Ramones were an ingeniously random band from the get. They were perhaps the greatest one-trick pony in rock history. No one rocked out harder over the most inane shit better than this band. Their
Mm.
quirkiness was God-gifted, and punk rock and all of rock really were much, much better for having received it. Arturo, what's your take on this album?
It's the last great Ramones album. After this album, they got monotonous and repetitive and same sounding. And unfortunately, I mean, I love the Ramones. I always will, but they didn't have the imagination or the skill or the talent of the Clash, who could
Yeah,
grow beyond punk rock. By the end, the Clash were, I mean, they were punk rock in name, but they went into so many different avenues of music. They just
yeah,
didn't have the scope of bands like the Clash or or
yeah,
some of the other bands or like Talking Heads or Blondie even. And
yeah.
so
One-trick pony.
they kind of remained in their shell. It's a hell of a shell. It's a great shell. It's one of the greatest rock and roll shells of all time. But after this album, you've heard one Ramones album, you heard them all.
Yep,
But it is a great record. It is a great record.
yep, absolutely. So speaking of great records, let's move on to Talking Heads 77. Talking Heads dropped their debut album in 1977, and it was a doozy. Three of the band members had met while students at the Rhode Island School of Design, and it was evident from the start that their freak flag flew a little freakier as they mixed funk and world beat rhythms into an ironic punk sensibility. David Byrne fronted the band with an oddball poignancy, and guitarist Jerry Harrison, bassist Tina Weymouth, and drummer Chris Franz laid some of the strangest yet tightest grooves in the history of the entire rock canon. The inklings of this band that became so seminal on subsequent records can be seen here on Talking Head 77. The opening song, Uh-Oh, Love Comes to Town, is a humorous curveball, serving up a Motowny vibe more befitting of the Jackson 5 than that of Television, Patti Smith, or any of the band's other CBGB-based peers. The song is a soul pop nugget whose only hint of true oddity is the choice to use calypso-style percussion on the song's hook and verses. The rest of the album, however, veers into more unorthodox territory. The band follows Uh-Oh, Love Comes to Town with New Feeling, which might as well be the template for the band's more standard vibe. Jangly guitar, rhythm guitar, dance rock groove, and yelpy, inert vocalizing by Byrne. Who Is It is straight white boy funk, serving as a hip-shaking, bow-inducing riff, and then segueing into a quirkier, quieter chorus. The book I read finds Byrne in hopeless art boy romantic mode. Man, the book I read is in your eyes, girl. As the band bops along to another offbeat groove, this one featuring an organ. The highlight of this album, of course, is the song that most of you probably know, the indelibly dark but bouncy Psycho Killer, which features one of rock's most recognizable and most pulsatingly thumping bass lines.
Yeah.
Byrne plays the title wacko a little too perfectly, combining an eerie speak-sing with a rockabilly-style crooning. The periodic slip of the lyrics into French makes the tune especially twisted. Talking Heads 77 is a fun initial romp through the collective mind of this band. It's a collective mind that would grow tighter and stranger and more adventurous and much more thrilling over the course of the next several albums. Arturo, what say you?
Here's the thing about Talking Heads, for a band that was really like right smack in the middle of that New York CBGB scene, they were not a punk band. They
Nope.
weren't anything close to a punk band. If anything, they were proto indie rock. When you hear Talking Heads, you hear the germs of like early Modest Mouse, even the Pixies at their softest.
Oh
You can
yeah.
hear Vampire Weekend, forming within them. That's what they were. The Talking Heads were proto indie rock more than anything else. And of course, of all the bands that came out of the New York scene, I think they were the most visionary. Now
Yeah, I
you
do
hear
too.
some of it on this album, but way more on the albums that follow. And
Yeah,
they were the most eclectic, versatile, innovative,
thrilling.
original, downright original of all those new well, television are pretty damn original too.
Yeah, I was gonna say.
Yeah, but yeah, they were the most innovative of them all. And yeah, yeah. They weren't punk, they were proto indie rock, you know.
Yeah, for sure. Now, if Talking Heads was the most original band, Television was a very close second in the
Yeah.
originality department, and they had themselves a hell of a 1977 with the release of their album Marquee Moon. So let's
Hmm.
talk about Marquee Moon. Marquee Moon was Television's debut album, coming nearly 4 years into a tumultuous early run as a band that, including a falling out with co-founding member Richard Hell. We'll talk about him in a couple minutes, but needless to say, it's one of the strangest backstories in all of rock that Hell was a member of this band.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, the album stands as one of the most exciting and thrillingly original releases of the entire punk era. Bandleader and bona fide guitar god Tom Verlaine was as inspired by jazz as he was by rock and roll, and the songs on the record all have a twisting, mind-bending quality to them. The songs juxtapose tight rhythms and taut lead lines with Verlaine's exploratory, emotionally raw, and more than occasionally beautiful guitar soloing. No power chords are injured over the course of this record. It serves up something delectably more complex. It's as if listening to Marquee Moon should be more of a profound psychic experience more than anything purely musical in nature. Chief among these songs is Friction and the title track. Friction counts as dance rock, with a shuffling, boogie-riffic beat accompanied by an exotic, hypnotizing lead line and a crunchy rhythm guitar part. The song continues to build as Verlaine's guitar climbs into ever noisier and nastier realms. It's one of the best 4 and 3/4 minute stretches of pure rock and roll imaginable. Marquee Moon, the song, offers something even headier. It builds itself around a delicious riff and a menacing two-note bass line that serve as a launching point for Verlaine, the guitar hero, allowing him to unleash fury, fire, and oddly real pathos on and off for over 10 minutes, 10.5 minutes. The song is effectively jam rock tucked into an ideal template for an early new wave groove. Quite an accomplishment, I'd say. Marquee Moon is currently listed at number 107 on Rolling Stone's updated list of the 500 greatest albums ever made. It arguably should rank higher. No one
Yeah.
spliced the sardonic wit and nasty energy of punk with the musical sophistication and sensuality of a savant better than Verlaine and company. You can also argue that several subsequent forms of rock, including new wave, goth, post-punk, and even post-rock, were germinated
Yeah.
as a result of Marquee Moon. It's that influential and important to the development of the rock and roll we all adore today. What a special album, right, Arturo?
Yeah. You know what? This band Television, they were not a punk band. There's another
No.
band that wasn't punk. And if Talking Heads were proto indie rock, these guys were proto alternative rock
Yeah.
because you can hear like the seeds of what would become Radiohead. I can hear bits of Radiohead in Television. I hear bits
Yeah.
of the Strokes, especially with some of those lead guitar lines. Very
Yeah.
influential on the Strokes. And here's another thing. They were Television were influential on bands that came very soon after them. When I listen to the Cars, especially their first album, it's
Yeah.
just a very, very pop version of Marquee Moon.
Yeah, no, I
Is
agree. I mean,
is what it is.
the lead lines on this album are absolutely legendary all
Yeah.
throughout. I mean, it just
And the
beautiful
lead
lead line
lines.
arrangements.
And here's the thing, you listen to tell, especially some of the jamming they do on the title track and a couple of the other songs. It's almost Grateful Dead-esque.
Yeah.
You know, it's very Jerry Garcia in times with Verlaine's guitar playing, which is, you couldn't get more anti-hippie than the punk movement in the 70s. But here's a band that kind of echoes the Dead in some ways.
Yeah, no, that's true. As I said, Verlaine is a real guitar hero, and just his lead lines are just beautiful, and there's almost a power to his playing too that like he kind of like he kind of doubled as both rhythm and lead, and so
Yeah,
the riff on Friction combined with the soloing on Friction is a
yeah,
is a real treat, and
right, right.
just a real dizzying combination. It's pretty incredible.
Yeah. All right, what's the next album? The next New York CBGB's album here.
And we're going with Richard Hell's Blank Generation. So let's
Hmm.
talk about Richard Hell. So Richard Hell ran away from home with boyhood friend Tom Verlaine. Strange but true. They grew up in the same town in Delaware when the
Wow.
two were in high school. The break into the night was indicative of a restless energy that never quite relented within Hell. He lived the punk vibe as much as he loved it. He was one of its most in-your-face practitioners, and Blank Generation was his loudest artistic statement. Released with his band, okay, I'm
The
gonna get it wrong.
Voidoids.
Voivoids,
The Voidoids.
the Voidoids.
There you go.
Okay, released with his band, the Voidoids. The Blank Generation served up one cutting attitudinal song after another. The album cranks right out of the gate with Love Comes in Spurts, a chugging, bratty anthem of forlorn punk energy. The song combines the competent groove with barely competent lead playing, something that more or less defined Hell's music. The brattiness never really relents on the record. Hey, sweetheart, cool off, Hell exclaims on the quote unquote ballad Betrayal Takes Two, which proceeds slowly and sexually but ever so loudly. Hell drinks his butt off and parties unapologetically on the bopping down at the Rock and Roll Club. Rock and roll, I want some more, he exclaims. Yeah, man. Then there's the title song, a swinging, swaggering absolute rocker where Hell proudly proclaims he belongs to a meaningless, shapeless, utterly hopeless generation, a sentiment he spikes with a cacophonous guitar solo and ironic oohing and eyeing and finger snaps. It's obnoxious but undeniably catchy. Hell and the Voidoids released just one more album after Blank Generation, 1982's Division Street, before Hell retired into a private writerly life. But Hell left behind quite a scorching legacy. Co-founder of television, mayor of the CBGB scene, and blaster of Blank Generation. His
Hmm.
contribution to the art form was pretty immeasurable, right, Art?
Yep. Yeah, totally. And he's still alive.
Yep.
Here's the thing about the Void, Richard Hell and the Voidoids. This Blank Generation album is a little closer to being punk rock than the previous
Yeah.
albums that we talked about, but it's still not quite punk rock. To me, it's just heavy new wave, is what it sounds like. Especially Love Comes in Spurts and that
Yeah.
weirdo quirkiness. Like, they don't know, they don't know,
Yeah.
those
Hmm.
aren't punk riffs, man. Those are like angular shit.
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
close.
it's definitely more angular and definitely a little more forward,
Yeah,
future seeking.
right,
But it's to
right,
me, it's still punk rock. It has the energy of punk rock,
right.
big time.
Yeah, yeah, oh, totally. I mean, but yeah, it is a fantastic. I have it as one of the greatest in my list of the 500 greatest albums of all time, and it should be. And it's probably the most underrated of all these albums that came out of New York. And they were probably the most underrated band because I think Television's Marquee Moon cast a long shadow, and unfortunately, Richard Hell, and he was a member of Television. His old band kind of superseded him a bit, a little too much, which is unfair. But Richard Hell should be remembered, and Blank Generation is a fantastic, fantastic record. All right. So now we went from the UK to the US, from London to New York. Now we're going to do all around punk rock, and we're going to do a lightning round of some of the best punk singles that came out during this incredible year of 1977. Where are we going to start with? Well, we're going to start in London. The Stranglers with Get a Grip on Yourself. The Stranglers were a niche punk band even within the British punk rock movement. One of the reasons is that they were an unabashed muso musicians band and had no interest in the herd mentality that quickly overwhelmed the scene's aesthetic and ideology. They had the gall to feature keyboards in their sound, and never more so on this driving, pulsating single where some genuine Rick Wakeman like organ fills dominate the sound. Prog rock punk. Woohoo! Next, The Heartbreakers, Born to Lose. Johnny Thunders was the lead guitarist for glam rock proto-punk band the New York Dolls, and shortly after that band dissolved, he formed the Heartbreakers in 1975 with bassist Richard Hell, who had just left the band Television. For a couple of years, they were one of the leading bands in New York CBGB scene alongside the Ramones, Blondie, and Talking Heads. Hell would leave the band soon to form his own band, the Voidoids, as you spoke of earlier, Chris, and Thunders kept the Heartbreakers going with himself as the band's undisputed leader and singer-guitarist. A chronic heroin addiction meant Thunders was only able to make one album, LAMF, but that album produced some incredible singles, one of them being the vivid and harrowing portrayal of the junkie's lifestyle, that is, Chinese Rocks, which he co-wrote with Dee Dee Ramone. But undisputedly, the best track on the album and one of the greatest rock singles of all time is Born to Lose. 14 years before Nirvana made self-deprecation and self-loathing sound crowd-pleasing, rocking, and anthemic, the Heartbreakers produced what is ostensibly a riposte to Bruce Springsteen's Born to Run, with its beer-soaked, druggy, woozy, sing-along chorus and Chuck Berry in drag riff. One of the greatest lines in rock history: living in the jungle, it ain't so hard, but living in the city will eat at your heart. Next, the Buzzcocks with Boredom. Before Howard Devoto formed the seminal post-punk band Magazine, he was the original lead singer for Manchester, UK-based The Buzzcocks, who soon would become known for injecting Beatlesque melodic pop into their punk sound. But on this track, they're in full-on punk attack mode with a killer riff and that incessant two-note hook, doody 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 doody, over and over and over again. Next, Puncture with Mucky Pup. Puncture were a no-name, no-prospects British punk band that only managed to put out one single and a B-side. But my God, is this one of the rawest, nastiest slices of pure punk rock anarchy that would have made the Sex Pistols blush. This song is sample A of just how uncompromisingly crude and fascinatingly vulgar the earliest punk rock was. Next, Swell Maps with Read About Seymour. Stephen Malkmus of Pavement once noted how the British band Swell Maps were an influence on Pavement's early sound, and you can hear it on this single. A bouncy riff, a raucous energy, irreverent yet witty lyrics, and an endearing amateur quality to the performance make this a classic of this era. Next, The Dead Boys with Sonic Reducer. These guys were one of the also-ran bands of the New York CBGB scene. In other words, they never made it out of the gutter the way the Ramones did, nor did they achieve superstardom like Blondie or Talking Heads. Frankly, they really weren't that great. But even mediocre bands have one good song in them, and the Dead Boys had this one. Sonic Reducer. The song was made famous in the mid-1990s when Pearl Jam, one of the biggest bands in the world at the time, would regularly feature it in their live sets, with Eddie Vedder never failing to mention whose song this originally was. Next, Metal Urbain with Panic. Hailing from Paris, France, Metal Urbain were the French's contribution to the punk rock movement, and they were so in a very innovative way. Arguably the first punk band to merge guitars with synthesizers and drum machines to generate an electro rock sound, they released a slew of singles in the late 1970s that were highly acclaimed by critics at the time and garnered a strong cult following in their native France. This particular track is the perfect representation of their very brief but pioneering career. Next, the Ramones. Sheena is a punk rocker. The Ramones' third album, Rocket to Russia, is when the band started to get redundant, repetitive, and not really doing anything to expand their sound. Nevertheless, they were still always good for a 2 to 3 song bangers per album, and this is one of the band's best ever singles. An ode to the life-saving force of rock and roll. Its girl power sentiment echoes many of Chuck Berry's rocking, girls breaking free anthems of the 1950s. Next, Blondie, Rip Her to Shreds. for a band that would go on to be one of the greatest and most commercially successful new wave bands of the late 1970s and early 1980s. It's pretty surprising to hear how mediocre and poorly written their self-titled debut album from 1977 is. Nevertheless, the standout single Rip Her to Shreds is a sterling example of how they could merge strutting, sexy sensuality with punchy, catchy pop rock in an irresistible package of retro 1960s kitsch with its swirling organ. Deborah Harry rarely sounded as vitriolic as she does here in her lyrical lambasting of a snooty club scenester and groupie. And finally, The Jam, with two singles, In the City and This Is the Modern World. The British band, The Jam, by the way. Before Paul Weller spent the 1980s degenerating into dreary, overly produced, unlistenable sophisto-pop with the Style Council, he was actually in a pretty groovy, punchy, tight rock band called The Jam. The first two records both came out in 1977 when Weller was still 19 years old, and they were as punk as The Jam ever got. Heavily inspired by the energetic rush of London's mod scene of the early to mid 1960s, particularly the music of The Who, the early Jam were basically a punk era update of The Who's early sound, and they were damn good at it. These two singles are the definitive documents of The Jam's early years. Chris, I just levied a bunch of singles at you.
Yeah, and a bunch of great singles. And, again, kind of like we did in the 76 episode, it really shows just the diversity that existed within punk rock that, like you had your popular stuff in there, like Ripper to Shreds, and you had your gnarlier stuff in there, like Mucky Pup, and, you had your kind of middle of the road stuff like Sonic Reducer. And and then obviously the Ramones Sheena is a punk rocker, which is a great song.
Yeah.
And then again, of course, then my favorite song on this record by far is Born to Lose. I mean
Yeah.
that is just one of the greatest songs ever. I mean, just rumbling nasty fuck you energy
Yeah.
going on there, and yeah, and I never really made the Springsteen connection until now, but that's a good call. That basically they were parodizing Born to Run
Yeah.
by doing Born to Lose. So yeah, I mean, I think a good pick for kind of the roll call of other punk singles, and a good way to end this segment, or the punk rock portion of this episode. What a special time that was. I mean, it was just everything was just changing, and changing for the better. I mean, what a time to have been alive. Imagine being a 19-year-old kid in 1977 with all this great music and all these great middle fingers that you could lobby at your parents coming out all at once.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Subject them to hear the entire Sex Pistols album.
Yeah.
Hey,
Yeah,
mom,
exactly.
these are my heroes.
Yeah, sit down and listen to the whole thing, bitch. Yeah. Yeah, seriously. Or like a playlist that has these kinds of songs in
Yeah.
them would have done the same thing. Although I think even mom would have liked Sheena as a punk rocker.
On this episode, we analyzed the awesome year of 1977 in our third Golden Age of Rock series. For the next episode, we're going to bow down to the majesty of the almighty Queen. One of the biggest and most popular bands of the 1970s and beyond, they almost defy description with how versatile and eclectic they were. They took heavy metal, prog rock, glam rock, traditional English music hall, and elements of classical music to create a concoction never before heard in the music landscape, a virtual subgenre all to themselves. They would go on to delve into R&B, soul, gospel, funk, disco, EDM, and even dip their toes into punk and proto-thrash. They did all this while crafting some of the greatest, most indelible hit singles of the rock era that endure as timeless classics to this day. Join us next time as the Curmudgeon Rock Report brings you Queen in the 1970s. Speaking of pop, we're now going to go over to Germany with the pioneering, the legendary, the group that Really, I mean, EDM as we know it wouldn't exist in the form we know it without Kraftwerk. Chris,
Yep, we're
we
gonna talk.
are the robots.
Yep, we are talking about Kraftwerk, and we're talking about their album Trans Europe Express. So let's get into this. Kraftwerk was formed during the early days of Germany's krautrock scene. Originally, like a lot of those early bands, they were more of an avant-garde jam band inspired by the Grateful Dead and other American psychedelic bands than any sort of compositional outfit. Florian Schneider, Ralph Hooder, and assorted bandmates were more apt to play around with flutes, pianos, cymbals, and chimes than they were to tinker with a synthesizer line. Granted, drummer Klaus Dinger did pass through the band as a member at one point, and Klaus Dinger of Neu! Fame, and
Yeah.
introduced his patented motorique drum pattern to their proceedings. Even so, Kraftwerk was nevertheless earthier in its initial stages than your average German band. Listen to the great album Kraftwerk 2 from 1972 for proof of that. That really is a great album. Well, boy, did things change. Boy, did things really change. Over time, no other band became as associated with the mechanical, electronic, metronomic, minimalist futurism of what most people think of when they contemplate krautrock. By 1977, Schneider and Hooter were fronting a full-fledged electropop band, and Trans Europe Express, released in March of that year, is unquestionably Kraftwerk's magnum opus. The band used a customized state-of-the-art 32-step, 16-channel analog sequencer, wow, to craft much of the music's striking music, which sounds more like a science fiction opera of the highest order than anything else. Seriously, check out the dizzying, frenetic, boomeranging synth loop that drives the rhythm to the Hall of Mirrors to get a sense of the futuristic vibe these guys were on by this point. Elsewhere, synths buzz and churn, keyboards swirl in a fit of organized chaos, mechanized drums shuffle all of the songs with a striking immediacy, vocoders alter the vocals in some monster and something. It. Let me start that over. Vocoders alter the vocals into something monstrous intermittently, and the imagery and sonic equivalency of trains rumble throughout the album, especially on the dramatically rendered chugging title track and its haunted house quality banging, clanging follow up metal on metal. Trans Europe Express's greatest and grandest musical statement may be the gorgeous Franz Schubert, in which the aesthetic beauty of classical music and the future pop vibes of synthesizer collide head on. The robotic synth loop here is positively hypnotic, and the strings that surround it lend it a surprising emotional depth. If anyone questioned whether David Bowie was influenced by Kraftwerk before listening to this track, they wouldn't. They certainly weren't afterwards. Both the compositional and technological sophistication here are stunning. We'll talk more about Bowie's 1977 efforts soon. Uh, Modern electronic dance music, or EDM for short, perhaps owes its greatest debt of gratitude to Kraftwerk for creating Trans Europe Express. The band on this album exploded the notions of what was possible through the use of all that technology, and that there was really warm artistry to be found on the other side of all those knobs and tubes. Beyond Bowie, other artists such as Gary Newman and New Order producer Arthur Baker were influenced directly by this album. Kraftwerk effectively created a genre here, one that still resonates to this day. Extraordinary stuff here, right, Arturo?
Yeah, I mean, here's the thing. When you listen to a verbal description of these songs and this music that Kraftwerk did, it sounds all heady and complex, and the synthesizers and the sequencers and and the generators and all that stuff. At its heart, this album is full of pop songs.
It
They're
is.
really catchy, hummable pop songs that
Yep.
stick in your ear and stick in your head. And that's what part of what made Kraftwerk so great. It doesn't matter. Yes, the production, the sound, the textures, but at its core, what makes people love this music is the great pop songs. And these guys wrote great pop songs. And yes, I agree with you. EDM as we know it would not exist without Kraftwerk. Electronic music as we know it today, electronic pop music, I should say, would not have its form without Kraftwerk. Kraftwerk were the band for that. They were the Beatles for EDM, really. And yeah, and this album is case number one why. It's the number one argument for it. They would go on to do great albums after this one. The Man Machine in '78,
Computer World.
that the Computer World, which Coldplay basically ripped off in their song Talk from their 2005 album. But
Yeah,
yeah, Kraftwerk are seminal. I think this album is easily one of the 100 greatest records of all time. Maybe it's in the
agreed.
middle at least in
Agreed.
that list.
Yeah,
Yeah,
agreed.
it's
It's
just
just
a seminal moment in 20th century music is this album. Really
yeah,
is.
you're right that the most striking thing about it is how beautiful it all is,
Yeah,
despite how mechanized it is. It's just
right.
beautiful.
Yeah, they brought humanity to electronic music way before anyone else did. At the very beginning of electronic pop music, here's Kraftwerk humanizing it. People always criticize EDM and electronic music as not human enough. Kraftwerk are humanizing it from the get-go. It's
Yeah,
the artists that followed Kraftwerk that dehumanized it.
yeah, that's true.
You
Yeah,
know,
that's true. Was about as human as it got.
yeah. So, all right. Now, speaking of humanizing electronic music, here we go into David Bowie in one of his greatest years. In the previous 1976 episode of this third Golden Age of Rock series, we discussed how David Bowie's Station to Station album was a transition record between his plastic soul period and the more experimental sound he pursued in the late 1970s, as evident specifically in the title track's first half and its brooding art rock. After his North American tour ended in April '76, Bowie's cocaine addiction was reaching a crisis point, and he decided to finally kick his habit and head out to Berlin, Germany, to personally recharge, creatively recharge, and hopefully record some new music. Going to Germany was no mere coincidence. By this point, Bowie had become obsessed with much of the progressive rock and electronic music coming out of the country at the time, particularly the hypnotic, motorique grooves of Neu, the improvisational avant funk of Can, the alluring electronic pop of Kraftwerk, and the brooding electronic soundscapes of Cluster. Brian Eno, formerly of Roxy Music, and having already released a series of critically acclaimed albums that progressed from skewered art pop to ambient electronica, had already worked with the collective known as Cluster, and Bowie knew he wanted some of that mojo in the new music he was writing, which was radically different from anything he, or anyone else for that matter, had done so far. With Eno in the role of collaborator and Tony Visconti as producer, the three would go on to some of the most, and do some of the most groundbreaking and influential music of the 20th century. The first of these albums to come was Low in early 1977. It's hard with modern ears to appreciate how utterly strange and alien this album was when it dropped. Bowie was a big name commercial artist whose recent hits were drenched in soul and funk. Here he was delving into sounds and textures completely foreign to North American ears and only familiar to those into underground music in the UK and Europe. It's an album that sounds like two albums thrust together, yet it holds together and works seamlessly as a whole. The first half alternates between instrumental tracks and tracks with vocals, adding to the jarring strangeness of the record. The drums are heavy, but they aren't heavy metal heavy. They have a thundering, brutal sound, yet have an odd warmth to them, no doubt due to Dennis Davis's raw drum track being processed through an Eventide H910 harmonizer. Carlos Alomar's guitars are gnarly and twisted, yet crisp and with a full, thick sound. The songs are funky and danceable, but not in any way connected to R&B, soul, or Black American music. With Eno's array of synthesizers buzzing around the mix and providing layers of texture, it's more like mutant space alien funk. Songs like Speed of Life, Sound and Vision, Breaking Glass, and the shape-shifting English music hall disco hybrid of Be My Wife just bristle with invention, innovation, and exotic cool. The second half of the album is probably Bowie's most radical departure ever as a musical artist. The ambient soundscapes that Bowie and Eno concoct together manage to not be cold and distant, but rather warm, moving, and full of lyricism in their own way. Tracks like Warzawa, Art Decade, Weeping Wall, and Subterraneans were absolutely nothing like any mainstream band or artist were doing at the time. Later in the year, Bowie released the album Heroes, the second of the Berlin collaborations with Brian Eno. It's easy to label the record as Low Part 2, and for sure, it lacks the shock of the new that the previous record has or had at the time. It's even structured the same way, with the first half having the quote unquote songs and the second half having the ambient instrumentals. However, repeated listens reveal that Heroes has its own wonders to revel in. First of all, Heroes has something that Low doesn't have, and that is a titanic single, one of the most brilliant and most enduringly timeless songs of Bowie's career, and that's the album's title track. A song about two lovers finding strength in each other's love in the face of overwhelming odds. It's a, well, heroic sing along of
Yep.
anthemic proportions. Album opener Beauty and the Beast consolidates the space alien funk and utter otherness of Low's first half into an overwhelming scorcher of a song. The album's second half continues Low's modus operandi with some beautiful ambient tracks in Sense of Doubt, Moss Garden, and Neukölln before something weird happens. And that's saying something for this album. The ambient soundscapes give way to album closer The Secret Life of Arabia, a delectable oddball of a track that manages to merge lounge pop, the sophisticated piano groove of Latin music, a disco beat, and Bowie's appealingly histrionic vocals and unique phrasing. It's probably one of the most bizarre endings to an album in rock history, but endearingly so. There would be one more album to Bowie's Berlin trilogy, the criminally underrated Lodger from 1979. But with Low and Heroes and their innovative use of synthesizers, reverb heavy drums, ambient soundscapes, and crackling guitars, David Bowie almost invented the 1980s and the sounds that would dominate most of the pop music landscape for that decade. His glam rock period of the early 1970s may be his most iconic era, but this late 70s period is arguably his most important. Chris?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that in terms of importance, it's right there. And I think that you hit the nail on the head. He really did kind of presage the 80s with a lot of this sort of, especially in Low. I mean, both sides.
Yeah.
I've really come around on Low and
Mm,
over the last few years, and it's just a stunning record of, I mean, just the fact that it crackles the way that it does on the first half, and then it has such great pathos and such drama on the second half. It just, just a really special concoction, and like just like the song Warsaw or Warsaw, it
Warzawa.
just
Yeah.
Warzawa. It just, I mean, it's just that really special keyboard playing in it, and this sort of the just really avant-garde. I mean, it's the kind of thing that I could see being a huge influence on several British new wave fans. Arguably, you don't get Ultravox without Warzawa.
Sure. Yeah.
You know, yeah,
Yeah.
you could pretty much say that. So, and then Heroes, not quite as good, but it has it has the big hit on it,
Right.
and it's a huge hit, and it's a wonderful song. It's just a wonderful soaring anthem and just bigness. And so, Bowie was on a real roll in 1977, and who knows where this came from. I mean, yeah, you had the influence of the Kraftwerks and the Noise that were on him, but it would, but he Bowieized it,
Yeah.
and just really kind of like even like Sound and Vision, which is just to me, Sound and Vision is more related to kind of Young Americans and Station to Station
Yeah.
than it is this album. It's like a the continuation of that kind of soul funk that
Right.
him and Carlos Alomar were coming up with during that period. So, but anyway, special record, special time, And man, imagine being in Berlin in 1977, where you had Trans Europe Express and these albums going on, and you had all these artists that were, and Iggy Pop was hanging around
Right.
at this
We'll,
time
we'll,
too.
we'll
Which
talk about his two albums of 1977. We'll talk about that shortly.
yeah, we'll talk about that here in a bit. But that must have been a special scene to be in. Oh, to be a fly on the wall, or oh, to be a 19-year-old kid living in Berlin in
Yeah.
1977. That must have been really special.
All right. Now we're flying back to the US with a, well, two-thirds British band at this, no, three-fifths British band, two-fifths American, and, well, one of the greatest records ever made. Chris?
Yep, we're going to be talking about Fleetwood Mac's Rumors, which really is a special album and really holds up incredibly well. So let's talk about this. There may not be an album of popular music that has aged better than Fleetwood Mac's Rumors. The further it gets away from pop chart nirvana and pervasive media hype and cultural zeitgeist-worthy print journalism gossip columns, the more we as listeners realize just how magnificent and powerful what Lindsey Buckingham and his bandmates pulled off actually was. Nearly 48 years after its release, Rumors, which hit store shelves in February of 1977, stands as a note-perfect pop album that still sounds like it was made yesterday and jumps out of the speakers with an undying urgency. That the album was made at all is something of a small miracle. Picture a famous five-person band in the fresh aftermath of two romantic breakups among members trying to make this album today. I mean, given the pervasiveness of social media and the swollen and increasingly malignant cultural narcissism that
Yeah.
dominates things today, these folks might not have lasted 2 weeks on such an effort, never mind almost a full year.
Right.
But that's what Fleetwood Mac endured back in the mid 1970s after founding bassist John McVie and keyboardist and co-vocalist Christine McVie divorced, and guitarist, vocalist, producer Lindsey Buckingham and singer-songwriter vocalist Stevie Nicks broke off their years-long relationship. Oh, and there was the fact that Mick Fleetwood and Nicks also had an affair during the making of this record too.
Yeah.
Now, given all of that, I can't even imagine, for instance, how McVie maintained his professionalism and delivered such a strong bass performance on You Make Lovin' Fun,
Mm.
on which Christine McVie feats her brand new lover with glowing praise. Same goes for Buckingham, who delivers a masterclass in rock and roll arrangement and production on Nix's Dreams, clearly a fuck off ballad about him,
Yeah.
or how they all found the magical synergy together in co-writing The Chain,
Mm.
which is which is basically a narrative about saying you said we'd never break the chain, but you did. So it's a lament about all their collective circumstances on which all five of them contribute songwriting to. Go figure. Clearly, cocaine was a hell of a drug, as it seems the small mountain of coke the band kept active on its production console sustained them really damn well through all the turmoil. Beyond that, there was the unifying power of knowing that they were members of a great band making music of a quality that had rarely been achieved. They had just made a great record in its own right, 1975 self-titled debut, which grew into or self-titled effort, which grew into a chart topper during the making of Rumors. They had mucho momentum on their side. Why let romance, heartbreak, and other bullshit distort or disrupt that? And so we got the 3 minute slice of perfection that is secondhand news, a remarkably simple but powerful Buckingham tune that leads off Rumors. And we got the anthemic Don't Stop, on which Buckingham and McVie take turns singing about undying optimism, and McVie's piano and Buckingham guitars drive the song's peppy groove. And we also got Nix's marvelous Gold Dust Woman, the album closer that finds her singing with a maximum sense of melodic drama over a slow-burning bed of guitar licks and percussion taps. And we also got a shameless piano ballad, Songbird, that's nevertheless so beautiful that we forgive its saccharine origins immediately. Listening to Rumors is an experience that never really grows stale. The most surprising thing about it is how much more it resonates with me now that I'm almost 50 years old than it did when I was half this age. Nix, Buckingham, and McVie all possessed remarkable wisdom and clarity as songwriters, which is pretty awesome considering Buckingham and Nix were in their late 20s and McVie was in her early 30s when they wrote all of these songs. So as I mature, so do these songs and their melodies and their harmonies and their hopeful lyrics mature in my mind. What a remarkable accomplishment by this band. It definitely deserves its placement at number 7 on Rolling Stone's 2020 update of the 500 greatest albums ever made. Arturo, what's your thought on Rumors?
I don't put it at number 7. That's a little too high for me. I have it very, very, very high on my 500 greatest albums of all time list. I'll just say it's above 50. I'll put it that way. But it's I don't put it that high. But yes, this is a perfect record, and is one of the most perfect albums ever made. The way I would call this the Pet Sounds of the 70s is what this
Yeah,
really
I think that's fair.
because Pet Sounds is all about disillusionment. Really, the album is about disillusionment, romantic and growing older and realize the innocence lost and all that. Well, Rumors is
Yeah,
the next stage of innocence lost. This is like, wow, life is crap.
yeah,
Romance, love sucks.
yep, pretty
That's kind
much.
of like what Rumors is about. But even though, despite some of like Christine McVie's searingly emotional and romantic songs that she has on this record, but yeah, okay, like you were saying, it's just all the writers in this band were firing on all cylinders. Buckingham, Nix, and McVie were just really, really, really like on a roll. The rhythm section is tight. It's just everything about it. It's the perfect record. Like you said, you pretty much said it all.
Yeah, no, it really is. I mean, and yeah, and it's a good thing that you mentioned the rhythm section, which I hadn't covered. The amazing thing about it is Mick Fleetwood's playing is really, really kind of quirky and eccentric in the sense that he makes sure he comes in on the last possible moment of the beat
Right.
and to make his fills, and so it gives it this kind of shuffle, or it kind of moves it forward, and it almost gives it more of an immediacy just by the way that he drums. It's pretty incredible.
Yeah.
And then John McVie has the best bass line on the entire album, the one he wrote on the
Mm,
Chain, which
right.
segues into the solo on that album on that song, which is
Right.
probably, I don't know, my favorite song on that record is either the Chain or Secondhand News.
Yeah. It's
Yeah,
hard for me to have a favorite. The first track on the album is really fantastic
yeah,
too.
Secondhand News.
And
Yeah,
so, I mean, I don't know. Everything, yeah, it's hard to pick a favorite song on this. I mean, it's a band clearly indebted to the Beach Boys, clearly indebted to the Beatles. And you get those two sounds and you put them together and you wrap it up in a whole lot of 1970s grade A cocaine and you get Rumors and you get real romantic relationships falling apart. That's the other ingredient.
yep, yeah. I was gonna say so yeah. So that's what I got to do. I got to break up with my wife so I can make a great album.
Hey man, great art always comes from heartbreak and depression. Always does. That is a
Yeah.
time honored. It's not even a theory. Time honored fact.
So yeah. So time for us to get heartbroken and depressed, Arturo.
Yeah, I know. Well, it's kind of hard to when we're talking about the next artist and the final full length album discussion we're going to have, and that is Bob Marley. So many great people had great 1977s. Probably no one had a bigger, better 1977 than Bob Marley. Bob Marley's rise to international superstardom was a slow but steady climb. From his early recordings in 1970 and 71 as a member of the Wailers with Lee Scratch Perry, to getting signed to the UK's Island Records and all their licensees in North America and Europe. From his stepping out in front as the main star with those first three Island albums, Catch a Fire and Burnin' in 1973, Natty Dread in 1974, to the word of mouth spread of the brilliance of his scintillating live shows, especially in the US. From his scoring hit singles, not just in his native Jamaica, but throughout the UK and Europe, culminating in his major breakthrough, the 1975 live album and its iconic live version of No Woman, No Cry. By 1977, Bob Marley was not only the single most defining figure of an entire genre, reggae, but he was, and probably still is to this day, the most famous person to ever come out of Jamaica. For some
Yep,
people, then and now, when they think of Jamaica, Marley is the very first person that comes to mind.
I do.
His yeah, his popularity in the Caribbean is beyond formidable, but his ability to break into North American and European markets as well as becoming an icon in African countries is a staggering accomplishment, and it simply wouldn't have happened if it weren't for Marley's genius for writing rich, emotional, lusciously melodic, vividly lyrical songs that transcended cultural, racial, and national boundaries. He has become a symbol of standing up for racial equality and standing up to racial and social injustice, socioeconomic inequality, political corruption, and overall hatred. Everything I've just said became solidified with the monumental success, both commercial and critical, of his 1977 album Exodus. Of all his albums, it's the one that holds up the most as a unified, cohesive piece, and that's saying something considering how many knockout albums he has in his discography. It's the studio album that has the highest quotient of all time timeless classics. Three Little Birds, the title track, Jamming, Waiting in Vain, One Love, People Get Ready. They may not have charted highly as individual singles, but from 77 to 78, these songs blasted out of album track oriented radio stations all over the world, catering to both white and black listeners. If Led Zeppelin were the band of the 1970s, the question begs to be asked, who was the solo artist of the 1970s? There are some good nominees. David Bowie, Stevie Wonder, Marvin Gaye, Neil Young, Elton John, maybe Joni Mitchell. But if you account for enduring legacy, influence, and especially cultural impact, Bob Marley arguably trumps them all. Chris?
Yeah, I think as a figure and as kind of a legendary figurehead for reggae in Jamaica, Marley is a true icon. Me personally, I prefer his stuff from 73, 74, like when he did Burnin' and Natty Dread. I mean that
Mm,
was like more purely reggae. This album, because you have stuff like Is This Love
yeah,
and Jamming, which is just it's more sort of reggae influenced pop than it is
right.
reggae. Although it does have Three Little Birds, which I think is his best song on
Mm,
it. So it has that one little escape back into true reggae. But so I'm a little biased. I mean, Burnin' is his last album with the Wailers when Peter Tosh and Bunny Wailer were still
right,
around, and so the balance of that record and the diversity of the songwriting, that's the Marley album that always blows me away because that's the one that has Get Up Stand Up on it,
right,
and I Shot the Sheriff, and so
right,
and then One Foundation by Peter Tosh. So I've always been a huge fan of that, and then obviously Natty Dread, which has the original version of No Woman No Cry on it.
right, right.
Uh, just uh, just incredible stuff there. But I like this album, and again, I think that it's probably his most like it's certainly his most easy listening
Right. Well, I
album.
mean, yeah, it's a pop reggae album because it's the one that really made him a superstar around the world, right?
Yeah,
Duh, no duh, it's a pop reggae record. It was his like this is the album that made him famous with like housewives. You
yeah,
know?
exactly. All of whom he probably fucked because because
He was known to get around.
yeah, Marley has what is the number? He's got like 27 kids that he actually acknowledges. There's a process to be acknowledged as a child of Bob Marley with the
Yeah.
Marley estate that he probably had hundreds of kids, but
Yeah.
there's like 30 that
Mm,
actually get recognized as his kids.
yeah.
Yeah,
He had a lot of children.
yeah, it's a little bit strange, but no,
Here's a fun fact. Toward the end of 1999, at the end of the century and the millennium, Time magazine named Bob Marley's Exodus as the greatest album of the 20th century.
huh.
Yeah,
I mean, I could see why.
Yeah.
because of the power it had and the kind of the unifying.
Right.
You talk about the unifying power of music.
Yeah.
That you're talking like just universal melodies
Yeah.
and universally beloved figure. I could see why they would do that
Mm.
because, I mean, it transcended politics, it transcended race, it transcended borders, it transcended nationality. So I could see why Time would do that. Chris here again. We usually end our episodes by inviting you to join our Curmudgeonly community page on Facebook. Well, we're picking up our efforts there. Know people just as passionate as us about rock and roll? Invite them to join in the fun. You don't actually need our permission to do so. Also, expect to see a lot more content up there moving forward. Our mission is to engage you, so darn it, we'll engage you like a fire hose, or maybe like a firehouse if we're going to give love to Gene Simmons. We may also be making a few offers. Want to wear a t-shirt featuring our logo? You may have that opportunity soon. So be a fellow curmudgeon, help us expand our little community, and share your own musings via your own posts. We're at facebook.com/groups/curmudgeonrock.
All right. We talked about a lot of great albums. There were a shitload of other albums that were great in 1977, but we only have so much time. So we're doing a semi-lightning round of other great 1977 albums that should be mentioned. Chris, we're going to start with you. You're going to take us to the Great White North of Canada and arguably Canada's greatest band.
Yeah, Rush. Yes, yes, we're being serious. Rush is Canada's best band, and I totally buy that. So anyway, A Farewell to Kings is the album they came out with in 1977, and I'd say A Farewell to Kings is my favorite Rush album because it's the one where they best balance their prog rock leanings with accessible pop craftsmanship. The Canadian power trio had effectively broken out big the year before with the space rock masterpiece 2112, and now with their follow-up, they proved that there was much more to admire about that band than Neil Peart's odd sense of the celestial and Geddy Lee's impossibly high-pitched screaming. A Farewell to Kings is a genuinely exciting listen, starting as it does with the lilting acoustic guitar intro to the otherwise rollicking title song, and ending as it does with the charmingly goofy science fiction rock out Cygnus X1, which has one of the greatest bass lines of all time. In between, there's a couple of the best songs in the entire Rush catalog, namely the straightforward balladry of the ultra melodic Closer to the Heart and the progged out octopus armed drummed majesty of Xanadu. Seriously, Neil Peart reaches god levels here, making the
Yeah.
album one of the best air drumming extravaganzas for listeners ever. And that's it. Arturo, what do you say?
That's it. Yeah. Listen, my favorite, I still say Rush's greatest song is Closer to the Heart. I think it's the best lyrics Neil Peart ever wrote. And it's the
Yeah.
song that I want played on at my funeral.
Okay,
That's the one
I'll keep that. I can't be the executive of your estate, but I can make sure that they play Closer to the Heart at your funeral.
Thank you, Chris. All right. Now, next, we stay in Canada with Joni Mitchell and her album of that year, Don Juan's Reckless Daughter. Now, first, let's address the album cover. It's racist and offensive as hell. It shows 3 pictures of Mitchell, each with her in a different outfit. In one of them, the dominant picture on the cover shows her wearing blackface and dressed in full-on minstrel clothes. When you take into consideration how she was allegedly known to throw the N-word around in casual conversation, at least in her younger days, it doesn't paint a flattering picture and should ring alarms for the cancel culture police. So, if younger generation fans can forgive Joni Mitchell for this, they can also forgive the Rolling Stones for Brown Sugar, right? Right.
Yeah, you would think.
Now, as for this album, yet another terrific double album that dispels the notion that most double albums are bloated and indulgent and should all be single albums. It continues and builds on the complex, jazzy folk of the previous year's Hejira, but with better songwriting and more stylistic exploration. Yes, folks, I do think Hejira is overrated. Disc 1 starts out with the hypnotic acoustic instrumental overture It's called Overture, segueing into the jazz folk masterclass Cotton Avenue, which recalls peak period Tim Buckley, but with better lyrics, of course. The standout on disc one, however, is the jaunty, bouncy Talk to Me, a track whose buoyancy belies the desperation and sadness of the lyrics, where Mitchell practically begs for more communication from her lover. She flirted with African rhythms on 1975's The Hissing of Summer Lawns, but she delves into full-on Afro-Cuban music on disc 2 with the all-percussion heaven of The 10th World before going into solely African tribal rhythms with Dreamland. Mitchell's genius for making strange acoustic guitar tunings sound majestic are never more prominent than in the downbeat groove of Off Night Backstreet and the lovely album closer The Silky Veils of Ardor, a traditional English folk sounding number that recalls Bert Jansch. After this album, Joni Mitchell would get into easy listening jazz pop before spending the 1980s mired in terribly produced attempts at pop rock. That makes, in my mind, Don Juan's Reckless Daughter Mitchell's last truly great album. Chris?
Yeah, it's an enjoyable record. I don't think it's as strong as Hajira, but it's pretty nifty. We need to mention though that Jaco Pastorius was the bassist on both of those records. That
Right.
Jaco was a legendary. What was he? He was Cuban, wasn't he?
I have to check it up. I've never bothered to research Jaco
Yeah,
Pastorius.
but he was a pretty special bassist, and a lot of his jazz work was pretty original. And so for him to have collaborated with Joni Mitchell is something. And obviously the bass playing is great. Like "Talk to Me" is a great song, ostensibly because it's got jazz inflected speak sing melody with just that bass playing by Jocko. So really special stuff.
Jaco Pastorius was American,
It was
born
American.
born in Pennsylvania. His mother was of Finnish descent, and his
Oh,
father was of German descent. So European descent, dude. Is
okay.
Jaco
So
Pastorius.
so he was an American European descent dude. He was not Cuban.
Nowhere near
He,
Cuban. Nope.
he wasn't that kind of Jocko.
No,
Okay.
not that kind of Jocko. All right, next. Well, Chris, you're the Neil Youngologist in this on this podcast. Tell us about American Stars and Bars.
Yeah, American Stars and Bars is an interesting hodgepodge of a record. Neil Young was in one of the greatest songwriting grooves in rock history heading into 1977. He had spent the couple years previous to that furiously cranking out one great song after another and leading one inspired recording session after another. By the spring of 1977, he had a quality problem on his hands. A bunch of unreleased tracks from aborted album projects or from random studio jams and no real place to put them. And so out of his teeming box of reels came this album, American Stars and Bars, which features 9 great songs culled from 4 different recording sessions. The stitching together of these songs results in, unsurprisingly, an eclectic album that ranges from the beautiful orthodox country tunes like Star of Bethlehem, featuring Emmylou Harris on backing vocals, to energetic country rock nuggets like the Old Country Waltz and Hey Babe, to absolute rockers like the epically jammed out Like a Hurricane and the Ode to Smoking Weed Homegrown. Ultimately, though, the standout track is perhaps again unsurprisingly the weirdest one, a tender acoustic 7-minute tale of a salmon swimming upstream called Will to Love. That was Neil Young in 1977, a musical Dr. Frankenstein who could assemble beautiful mutations like American Stars at Bars at will. It was a neat trick and a career filled with them. Arturo?
I love this album. I think it's a terrific record, one of his very best albums. Like a Hurricane is maybe one of his 10 best songs, period.
I agree.
Will to Love is fascinatingly gorgeous. I think Star of Bethlehem is one of his very best country songs. I like the country rock stuff of Saddle Up the Palomino and the Old Country Waltz. It's all great, man. This is a brilliant record. I'm a Neil in the '70s could do no wrong, and this is just proof of it.
Yeah,
All right,
absolutely.
so we go from Neil Young. Now we did 3 Canadian artists. Now we go back to the U.S.
New
and we're
York.
going we're going to New York, but not CBGB's. We're going to Long Island, the home of Billy Joel. and his album of that year, of this year, The Stranger. Going into 1977, Billy Joel's career was picking up momentum. He had scored hits with the popular standard Piano Man, as well as the moving ballad New York State of Mind and the Phil Spector-esque Say Goodbye to Hollywood. When The Stranger dropped in the summer of 77, though, its seemingly endless onslaught of hit singles catapulted Joel to the front line of pop rock superstars and as an icon of New York City that he still enjoys to this day. The sweet ballad, Just the Way You Are, the swinging folk pop of Only the Good Die Young, the Dylan-esque ambiguity of She's Always a Woman to Me, the loping piano pop of Moving Out, with one of Joel's most powerful social commentaries, indicting the shallow, vapid aspirations of the New York City working classes, and my personal all-time favorite Billy Joel song, the epic, rousing, multi-section suite Scenes from an Italian Restaurant, and its bittersweet lyrics about a crumbling marriage. All held together, all these songs held together a terrific album that is still to this day's, probably to this day, Joel's greatest album. Chris?
Oh, undoubtedly his greatest album. I mean, I know a lot of people liked his Innocent Man record,
Mm,
but this one takes the cake. It's just one great song after another, and it's forever deified by classic rock and soft rock radio. Like
yeah.
seriously, six of these nine songs on the album are staples of those formats. And the crazy thing is that Vienna, which is a seventh song, is actually the most popular song spun on Spotify with 680 million spins.
Wow.
Yeah.
Maybe all those people are from Austria.
Yeah, either that or it's I know it's become a concert staple for him. And so
Yeah.
it's kind of strange that like one of the songs that isn't all over the fucking radio is the most popular song on Spotify. So go figure. So
Mhm.
yeah, no, I just remember like I grew up on Billy Joel and never actually saw him live, but he's just like one of the most sing-songy guys imaginable. Like
Yeah.
he just really catchy stuff. And this album is just full of them. I actually liked it. I think my favorite song on that record is The Stranger.
Mm,
Yeah, just really rousing song.
mm. All right, Chris. So who do we got next on the album on this album semi lightning round?
Pink Floyd's Animals, baby. Pink
Mm.
Floyd's Animals. Animals is Pink Floyd's best album, and I don't think it's particularly close competition. Ostensibly a take on George Orwell's novel Animal Farm set to music, the album finds Floyd at its strangest but also its coolest. They piece together three long, jammy tunes called Dogs, Pigs, and Sheep and surround them with an ode to nihilism called Pigs on the Wing, on which Roger Waters does his best impression of an actual real singer. The result is a deliciously psychedelic and moving experience featuring some of David Gilmour's finest guitar work and definitely Richard Wright's finest keyboard work. Wright actually, to me, is the star here, adding flair and texture and a spooky weirdness to the proceedings. Seriously, the whirling keyboard noise that takes up the middle section of Dogs is more engaging than it has any right to be. The best of these songs, though, is Sheep, which starts out with the soulful electric piano playing by Wright and builds into a fast-paced, damn near unhinged prog rocker sung by Gilmour, whose guitar work is also stellar on the song. The song was not a small affair, nor were the others. These were made for a giant stage with giant stage props, something that became more associated with the next album, The Much Worse the Wall, but here at least the proceedings were astonishingly grand. What's your take on Animals, Arturo?
Yeah, this album to me is all comes down to one song, Pigs, three different ones, which is probably like the closest Pink Floyd has ever gotten to funk.
Yeah,
It's kind of a funk rock jam, and it's a
yeah.
fantastic track. But I'm not a fan of this album, the rest of it. I just think they disappeared down the prog rock rabbit hole a little too much. The songs are a little too meandering and plodding. And I think Roger Waters is a lyricist. His nihilism gets a little too much to bear.
Yeah.
It's too nasty, too angry, too dark. And it's like it's just he just comes across like an angry old rich white man, which is what he
Yeah.
became in real life.
Yeah, pretty much. But Gilmore just kills it on this record. Like the soloing on Dogs is like just really special. And also on Cheap, like it just there's just a he's a guitar god of the highest order on this album. It just you say he goes down a prog rock rabbit hole. Good. That's when they were at their best.
That's when they lost. I just don't, with the exception of Pigs, which I love, the rest of the album just leaves me cold. It's just even thematically, Pink Floyd were did better albums than this. But anyway, that's me. Now, speaking of funk, we move on to a true funk band, Parliament, and their album of this year, Funkin' versus the Placebo Syndrome. George Clinton picked up the baton from James Brown and carried the flag for hardcore funk throughout the 1970s with his more experimental, rock-flavored band Funkadelic and the more commercially successful, more strictly dance-oriented Parliament. After the monstrous crossover success of the all-time classic Mothership Connection in 1975, 1976's The Clones of Dr. Funkenstein was a bit of a commercial and critical disappointment, but the P-Funk crew bounced back in a big way with Funkin' versus the Placebo Syndrome, an album bookended by two of Clinton's greatest songs, and in fact, two of the greatest funk jams of all time. The 8-minute epic Bop Gun, Endangered Species in parentheses, and the endlessly bouncing, endlessly bopping Flashlight, a track that seemingly and single-handedly was the basis for everything Dr. Dre did in the 1990s.
Oh yeah.
The bluesy Wizard of Finance, the extended jam of Funkin' and the trippy spaciness of the Placebo Syndrome augment what is probably Parliament's second best album. Chris?
Yeah, I guess you took a preview of my notes because Flashlight. My thing on Flashlight, one, it's a marvelous piece of music, and just like you said, it's just bopped out, bunked out, and just cool as hell. But basically, it's the most stolen song in the entire G-Funk canon. I mean, it was sampled over and over and over again, and without that song, you don't even get what Dr. Dre was doing. So that's kind of its legacy. And then Bop Gun is just fun as hell too. And with Bootsy on vocals, this is like Bootsy Collins' finest moment outside of Sex Machine that he did for James Brown.
Yeah.
This is Bootsy Collins' finest moment on this record. He's the star, and man, that guy could do some bass slop from outer space, big time.
Right. All right, Chris, what's next? I think you got this next one.
Yes, I do. Al Green's The Bell album,
Ooh,
which I love. The
yeah.
Bell album was Reverend Al Green's last R&B album before he plunged headlong into preaching and gospel music for the next 2 decades. It's also one of his best albums overall, a self-produced effort filled with wondrous pop licks and engaging stomp-worthy rhythms. Yeah, he did the album without Willie Mitchell, he had been collaborating with up to that point throughout the 70s. And what it did is it put more of an emphasis on the guitar and more of an emphasis on the drum beat than had been on the other on the Willie Mitchell stuff. And so the title song, Bell, also stands as absolutely one of the most stunning statements in the history of popular music. On it, Al Green unleashes a gorgeous R&B ballad about leaving R&B behind for good in favor of Christ. It's you that I want, but him that I need, he belts at one point, rejecting the instant sexual gratification of this world in favor of the eternal gratification he stands to inherit in the next life. You'd be forgiven for missing the explicit religiosity if you fall victim to the wonderful melody and lush instrumentation that accompanies the song. Green wears less Jesus on his sleeve elsewhere on the album, which culminates with the lovely and sensual slow burner Dream, which is another great song. Al Green could do no wrong in the 70s, and he ended the decade tremendously well with the Bell album, really giving him an argument for Artist of the Decade, right, Art?
Yeah, he may be in the top 10 for the decade as a solo artist. Listen, think about this album. A lot of R&B, soul, and funk people by this time were plunging headfirst into disco. Al Green didn't, but there is a disco tinge to this
Yep,
album
there is.
overall.
I feel good.
Yeah, the disco is subtle. It's not over the top. It's under the table, and that's kind of what I like about it. And it differentiates what Green did on this record from the other albums that other artists of his genre, and how they tackled disco and how interesting. It's an interesting part about it. That's one of the things I love about this album. It's a subtle record. It doesn't hit you over the head. And
No, it
in
doesn't.
that it's a rich record, and it's a perfect album in its own right as
Yeah,
well.
I think it's a very perfect record, and I would actually put it second to Call Me
Yeah, it is.
of
I
all the
would say so
stuff.
too. I think it is his second best album.
Yeah, special record, special
Yeah.
record.
Next, Brian Eno, Before and After Science. While Brian Eno is more known for his deep explorations into electronic ambient music, I'm partial to the skewered, weirdo art rock he did on his two 1974 albums, Here Come the Warm Jets and Taking Tiger Mountain by Strategy. After splitting the difference between the two styles with his 1975 masterpiece, Another Green World, Eno spent the next couple of years deep diving into the lush world of ambient electronica as both a solo artist and collaborating with German group Cluster, as well as with David Bowie on his visionary albums Low and Heroes. When time came to put out another solo album, it seems that the edgier space alien pop funk of the first halves of those Bowie albums inspired Eno to reach back to avant pop, and the result is a thrilling record, the sound of an artist hitting on all cylinders either by himself or collaborating with others. No one receiving as an off-kilter rhythm that still manages to be hypnotic with its choppy guitars and percolating synthesizers, not unlike the spacey freakouts of New York electronic rock pioneers Silver Apples. Backwater is surrealist piano pop with a bendy, twisty melody, while the lush, sweetly melodic Here He Comes is almost downright normal, has a sweet pop song. Kurt's Rejoinder is dominated by its heavily processed bass line, its elongated synthesizer effects, and Eno's chanting vocals. However, all pales in comparison to the rollicking stomp of King Led's Hat, a track whose rhythmic intensity shows that Eno is paying close attention to the developments in punk rock. A terrific record and one of the most thrilling listens of this oh so thrilling year in music. Chris?
Yeah, it is a pretty thrilling listen, and the thing about it, maybe it shouldn't be too much of a surprise that it kind of had similarity to Bowie's work,
Yeah.
and also the similarities to the stuff he would soon do with Talking Heads.
Yeah.
That it has kind of a quirkiness to it and a rockiness to it, but also the fact that he also kind of divides the record the same way that Bowie divides Low,
Yeah.
with the faster, more moody songs up front, and then the more pastoral stuff in the back half, and the more
Yeah.
composerly stuff on the back half. So you know, it's a good record. It's a good record. I mean, obviously, I think Here Comes the Warm Jets is much better,
Yeah.
and probably his best album, but this one's pretty damn good.
Yeah. It is. All right. Now, Eno and Bowie worked together during this year, but there was a third guy who tagged along with Bowie to Germany, and he made two albums this year, and he worked with Eno. I think Eno produced them. Chris?
Now, Bowie produced them.
Bowie, sorry, Bowie, my mistake. I get those two confused. Sorry, folks. Bowie produced them. Yes.
Yep, absolutely. So, and this is Iggy Pop and his albums, The Idiot and Lust for Life. And so we'll talk about them each. Iggy Pop released two very different solo albums in 1977, The Idiot and Lust for Life. The former was produced by, basically, The Idiot was produced and co-written by David Bowie and can be seen as a companion piece to Bowie's own album, Low,
Yeah.
which was released earlier in 77. The Idiot is basically a colossal European dance rock record full of quirky rhythms and barely controlled energy. Pop
Yeah.
himself likened it to a hybrid of James Brown and Kraftwerk. In any event, the album was a much, much icier and electronicized affair than anything Pop had previously done with his band, The Stooges, making it a stark departure for him. Bowie was clearly having a blast using Pop as his experimental muse, and the vibes from songs like Sister Midnight and Nightclubbing clearly carried over into Low, which was actually recorded after The Idiot.
Mm.
The album, coincidentally, was largely recorded in France during a period when Bowie and Pop were both trying to kick their respective drug habits. And the album is perhaps most famous for including Pop's rocked out yet soulful take on China Girl, which became a big hit in slicker form in the US for Bowie in the early 80s. Now, if Pop resented Bowie for essentially using him to run lab work on what became his new Berlin-born sound, then I guess I wouldn't blame him. Maybe that explains why the follow-up to The Idiot, Lust for Life, is so much different. Lust
Yeah.
for Life, which oddly enough was also co-produced and co-written by Bowie,
Uh-huh.
plays much more like a Stooges record with a less tense production quality and noisy rockers that seem to extend beyond the walls of the studio they were recorded in. The title track is both groovy as hell and anarchic as hell, spiked as it is with towering drums and Pop's cynical vocals tamped down into the mix. Same deal with 16. Huge wall of guitar, huge drum sound, pained sex freak vocals. The album's most well-known song, "The Passenger," combines an instantly catchy guitar riff with a soulful, earnestly sung melody that again, a huge drum sound. The song is a hook-filled triumph, as is the album. I actually like this album more than I do The Idiot, which weirdly comes across as phony Bowie. Lust for Life, in contrast, is pure Iggy id and is much, much more iconic as a result. What say you, Art?
I like The Idiot a little bit more than Lust for Life. Lust for Life is a great album. There are a couple of clunkers in there for me. But yeah, they're two completely different records and they're both better off for it. You mentioned that Iggy Pop kind of resented Bowie for being Bowie's lab rat. For like working out this on The Idiot, working out the sounds that he would go on to with Low and even into Heroes. Well, you know what? Iggy shouldn't be pissed off about it because after these two albums, he never made a solo record nearly as good since. He never came close to being this good again, as far
Yeah.
as like solo albums go. So,
Yeah. So,
you
yeah,
know,
if Bowie carries his
say,
water, he
say,
should be
say,
glad.
should be glad. Yeah, should be saying thank you to David Bowie. Bowie was responsible for giving him his two best solo records, so get the hell out of here, Iggy. I love you, but still.
Yeah,
All
I
right.
know.
Now we get to the final album in our semi-lightning round and the final record we're going to talk about in this episode. We're going all the way down to Australia with The Saints and their debut album, I'm, in parentheses, Stranded. Now, on this podcast, we've talked at length about the great bands coming out of Australia these days. However, in 1977, Aussie rock was an unknown thing to most music fans not living in Australia, with only a nascent AC/DC starting to cause ripples. Coming out of Brisbane, the Saints moved out to the UK with the hopes of making it big with their brand of bare-boned, bare-knuckled, stripped-down rock and roll, only to find out the whole country was caught in the grips of punk rock mania. It's a testament to the greatness of the songs on the Saints' debut album and their ability to deliver as a live band that they fit right in the UK punk scene and made a name for themselves. The multi-tracked guitars are crucial to the gut punch power of songs like the title track, Erotic Neurotic, No Time, The Relentless Night in Venice, and yes, a kick-ass cover of Elvis Presley's Kissin' Cousins. The
Nice.
Saints would release two more albums, both released in 1978, before creative tensions between lead singer Chris Bailey and guitarist Ed Cupper, I think I pronounced it, or is it Cupper or Cooper, or whatever, the creative core of the band, led to Cupper leaving the band. Bailey would continue leading the band throughout the 1980s with a revolving cast of musicians, but no iteration of the Saints ever came close to the raw power and in-your-face attack of the original lineup, and never was that lineup more focused and finely honed than on their debut album, I'm Stranded. Chris?
Yeah, figures you leave the most obscure title on this list to yourself. Uh, yeah, it's the thing about this record. If they weren't from Australia, we could have included them in the earlier segment above all the debut records
Yeah,
from Britain
yeah,
because there's really not a whole lot of difference. It's a really great, straightforward punk record.
yeah,
Just well written songs bashed out delectably.
yeah,
And it's the same thing, like the song "I'm Stranded" is a lot of fun, and it's
yeah,
kind of funny because they actually were contemporaries of AC/DC,
right,
and before punk hit, I guess they were trying to be more like AC/DC, and then
yeah,
when punk hit, they were like, nope, well, we found our calling, we found our
yeah,
niche, and they
yeah.
fit into it, and they fit into it very, very, very well. It's a very orthodox punk record, and it would not have been out of place in Britain, which is why they did so well there.
Yeah. So definitely.
Gotcha. And hey, I have to put you on the spot before
Yes.
we finish. Now, folks, you should know Arturo. He does. I do a lot of the production and a lot of the promotional work for us. He is the creative guy, and he writes most of the scripts, and he kind of dictates, how these things go. And so I trust him explicitly with that, and he does a great job. However, I do have to kind of call you out for not including Steely Dan's Aja in this
Oh,
whole
you know
thing.
what? It honestly never crossed my mind.
Yeah,
It's how
I know
little I
you're not
think
a
of that album.
I know you're not a fan of that record, but so you actually left him out by accident.
I didn't even think about it. Steely Dan is not what I think of when I think of punk rock and electronic German music.
Yeah, well, well, yeah, no shit, no shit. But we do have to point out that Steely Dan's Asia did come out in 1977, and it's a pretty spectacularly well done record that I love and Arturo doesn't.
I just didn't think of it. I'm thinking of reggae. I'm thinking of like electronic music. I'm thinking of punk rock. I'm thinking of perfect California pop, like Fleetwood Mac. Sorry, Steely Dan doesn't quite, and their yacht rock doesn't quite fit in there.
Yeah, yeah, I guess so. It never crossed your mind that one of the top 50 albums ever made. Uh,
It's not one of the top 50 albums ever. Come on,
yeah, it
it
is.
ain't that high. Come on.
It's perfect, and it gets a reputation for being a little too anal, but so what? It's a perfect rock record, and just marvelously written, well written songs, and just marvelous production, and it deserves its props.
The singles
So
are pretty good. The singles
yeah,
are okay.
I could not let us escape without at least mentioning that record. You know, I
Well, we
trust you.
mentioned it.
I love you, and I trust you explicitly to do these things. But you missed Aja. Boo.
I
Okay.
replaced it with the Saints.
Yeah, 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 exactly. And probably did it gleefully. Oh God. Anyway, so yeah, we've officially reached the end of our discussion. Is there an overarching thing that you'd like to say about 77, or any sort of last word?
Explosion. It's just an explosion of so many, not just great albums, but from so many different genres and artists doing some of their best work all at the same time, the same year. Fleetwood Mac's best album, one of Billy Joel's best album, Parliament's second best album, Al Green's second best album, arguably Bowie's best album, Joni Mitchell's
Yeah,
last great album, the only Sex Pistols album, Kraftwerk's greatest album. It's just everyone. It's
yeah,
Iggy's best solo work. It's just one.
yeah, yeah.
Bob Marley's
Everybody was
obviously greatest
peaking.
album.
Every,
Everyone was peaking. Yeah,
Yeah, and so yeah, so in terms of the quality, yeah, you're
yeah,
right. It really is a strong ass album, or was a really strong ass year.
you're right.
Yeah, pretty remarkable. So, speaking of strong ass, we have to always remind you of our strong ass curmudgeonly community. And so we want you folks to join our curmudgeonly community on Facebook. It's a good time to be had by all up there. Arturo does a good job of keeping us in content, and we've gotten some good engagement lately. So join in the fun, folks. Go to facebook.com/group/curmudgeonrock. The group is invite only, but unless you're prohibited from being within 500 feet of a school, chances are we'll let you in. If you have anything to say about any of these albums or any of our opinions, if you think that we're full of crap, if you actually hate rumors, feel free to let us know. Write us at curmudgeonrock@gmail.com. And then, as always, we will have a special Spotify playlist dedicated to the music of 1977 to accompany this here episode. You can find the link for that in the episode description wherever you're accessing this podcast, whether it's Apple or Amazon or Spotify or wherever else. You can click on that link and enjoy this music to your heart's content.